Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wednesday, March 11th meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council. I'd like to begin with calling the meeting to order and roll call, beginning with Patrick. Fiorini here. We have a quorum, and we'll introduce the remaining folks at the head table soon. Now, housekeeping items. First of all, we have a different microphone system today. You're going to have to share. The button to activate the microphone is pretty evident. It's a silver button. Blue light will come on. But our technicians have advised me that you've got to hold the microphone very close to adequately project your voice. So please cooperate in that manner. Today's meeting is webcast. It's available on the Delta Council website, and I will presume as normal we have many people following along to hear what we have to say. There will be a 30-minute break for lunch. Council members, there is an envelope at your table requesting an $11 investment so that staff can then have the money necessary to purchase your lunch. That will be available at approximately 12 o'clock. We will break for a half an hour today, and our target ending time is 2:30. Today's a very busy day. I know some of you have multiple meetings that you're trying to cover, so 10 to 2:30 with a half-hour break for lunch is our schedule. Just as a reminder, the Delta Reform Act called upon the Council to lead a multi-agency effort to update priorities for state investments in Delta levee systems. Today is an example of what the Delta Plan and the Delta Science Plan have called for, a policy science forum. You may recall in October when we first discussed the role of science and how that would interact with the levee investment strategy work, there was a desire to have a science peer panel to discuss and review our methodology. But at that time, Phil Eisenberg questioned the need to have technical science input related to policy judgments. And so the panel that has been brought together today is that policy science interaction that and we'll look forward to hearing from a panel of experts today to help guide council members in policy decisions. In addition to the invited experts, there will be a couple of opportunities for the public to weigh in and provide testimony. So with that, I would like to call upon Dr. Peter Goodwin, who is going to help serve as facilitator for today's meeting and to begin the introductions. Doesn't sound like it.
Okay. Is that better? Not yet? How about that?
That's good.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you, Chair Fiorini, and good morning, everyone. And welcome particularly to our panel of experts. And we'd like to thank the panel for being here. First of all, for bringing the rain with you. You can come back anytime you like. And secondly, seriously, we recognize that you're all very busy people, and we appreciate that you're agreeing to step up and put in the time at fairly short notice, one, to read the materials that you've been given, to spend yesterday with some of the staff you're out in the field. And we really look forward to hearing from you today, that you'd be willing to come and share some of your experiences on levee strategies elsewhere in the nation and the world. So the purpose of the meeting, very briefly, is that this is one of the policy science forum of the Council, and if you're not that familiar with the Delta Stewardship Council, these members are faced with implementing and making some really tough decisions. And I know you're all involved nationally, and you probably hear about the national talk about very difficult socio-environmental, so-called SES challenges. And of course, this is probably the poster child for the nation in just how difficult some of these issues are. Just the complexity of the system, the dynamics of the system, with massive interannual variability makes this a particularly challenging place to work. The Council is committed to the use of best available science. This term is actually set both in state and federal law. And as part of that, the Council used principles of relevancy, legitimacy, or transparency and credibility. And this is part of that process. The Council frequently engages diverse expert opinions, both locally, nationally, and sometimes even internationally, to get the best available information. And this is just one such venue that helps with transparency and communication with the people that could be affected with the decisions made. So where we are in the process, Arcadis and the Council staff are in the very early stages of developing a tool that's going to help inform decisions related to levy strategy. And so today it's going to be a very free-flowing discussion, really to learn from your experiences and what could be translated to make the process here as fair and effective as possible. We're going to steer the discussion with a few questions of each of you to help get the Council get to the point where some of the questions they've had in how we may go about doing this. But your experiences and participation today will certainly help guide the Council's thinking in the coming months. So with that very brief introduction of what we're hoping to get out of today, we'd like to go around with self-introductions for the expert panel. If you miss anything, I may jump in. But we wondered if you could just give a brief synopsis of who you are, who you are with, and a brief summary of what your particular expertise that you bring related to levies. And what we're going to do is to go around the table and then finish with the staff at this end of the table. And the Council members will also introduce themselves, because as you'll see, they come back with very rich and diverse expertise on this very complex system. So perhaps we'll start on my right with Dr. Mount.
Good morning, Council. Thanks for inviting me. This is a topic I've been involved in for many, many years. My name is Jeff Mount. I'm with the Public Policy Institute of California, newly retired from the University of California at Davis, where I was the founder of the Watershed Center, which Patrick Johnson may well remember because he helped get it started many years ago. I do also have not just a long history in Delta levees, but I did serve on the flood board for at least 5 years till I was terminated by the Terminator. With enthusiasm 5 days after Hurricane Katrina for complaining that it didn't seem like a really good idea to put houses right behind those levees. So it was an auspicious day. It was fun. So again, thanks. I'm happy to contribute local knowledge here.
And I push. Good morning. I'm Alicia Kirchner. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers here in Sacramento. I specifically am the chief of our planning organization. So my particular background is and role is to investigate and develop investment decisions in the form of feasibility reports and deliver them to Congress with recommendations for federal investment in civil works type public works projects. So we have a long sort of tradition and role working with many of the interested parties here and watching in the Delta area and certainly throughout the Central Valley of California. So I really am trying to bring, hopefully, a policy perspective. In my particular position, I bridge technical and policy in terms of investment decisions from the federal perspective. So I hope to be able to provide some information and context from that perspective.
Larry Larson. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. My background is I got my engineering degree from the University of Wisconsin, and first job, in fact, was working for California DWR as an engineer on the California Water Project under Governor Brown. That's Pat, by the way. And I worked in design and on some of those infamous projects, for example, the Peripheral Canal. But one of the things that DWR did, and I still don't know if they worked the same way, but during flood season would send the engineers usually as junior engineers, out to walk the levees. And And if the levee was in dire straits, we'd get on the radio and they would send out busloads of prisoners to sandbag the levees. I don't know if they still do that or not, but that's what they were doing. And I was on that. This was December of '66, as I recall, and I think it was Twitchell Island. We were having slip circle failure, and the levee needed sandbags. So you'd have the sandbags thrown on top of the levee, and of course it was slip circle failure. This was tidal action. So then as the tide starts to go back out, you don't want the weight on the levee, so it's, all right, take the bags off. I'm sure the prisoners thought this was nothing but make work, but it was a lesson in, of course, the levees and the fragility of the whole system, if you will. Since then, I've gone back to Wisconsin. I ran the dam safety, floodplain management, wetland programs, and a number of things for the state of Wisconsin, and formed an organization with a group of others in the late 70s that's now known as Association of State Floodplain Managers. Nationwide, we have about 16,000 members, 36 chapters, state chapters, including one here in California, and do their policy work with Congress, the White House, all the federal agencies. I have been doing that for a number of years, worked with every one of the chief of engineers since Henry Hatch in '86, and the other federal agencies. We spend a lot of our time trying to get federal agencies to talk to each other and try to collaborate as much as they can. So that continues on. I'm now Director Emeritus, although I'm still working full-time for the association. So.
My name's Dennis Mileti. I'm a sociologist. I've spent my entire life investigating natural hazards and disasters, beginning with the flood in 1972 in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I've had many wonderful experiences over the years. For 10 years, I directed our nation's national repository for all knowledge and transfer of that knowledge into practice in the social and behavioral sciences on the University of Colorado campus. I was asked by the men and women from the federal agencies that comprise the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House to do an assessment of what's known in every field of science and engineering, including the social and behavioral sciences, regarding all natural hazards and disasters, and comment on the applicability and wisdom underlying the nation's policies and programs regarding dealing with all those hazards. I had 132 co-authors working with me, and the project took 5 years. I don't recommend working with 132 co-authors. That resulted in a book that made me the most cited scholar in natural hazards in the world, and it is the book that gave birth in FEMA to instituting programs of emergency management in our nation's universities and colleges. I worked on the oversight committee for the American Society of Civil Engineers regarding the impacts and consequences in their infinite variety of the levee failures during Hurricane Katrina. I've just finished a project for the Army Corps here in Davis, where we were able to develop, based on all knowledge that exists, ways to quantify and estimate life loss from dam and levee failures, and produced a community guidebook they may begin disseminating soon. In the Clinton administration, I was chair of the Board of Visitors to the FEMA's Emergency Management Institute in Emmitsburg, the group that trains all emergency responders and managers in America. I chaired the Committee on Natural Hazards in the National Academy of Sciences. I was appointed by the Terminator, not fired, to serve as a state seismic safety commissioner here in Sacramento, which I did for 4 years. And I've got a variety of different consulting experiences for the private sector as well as government. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here. I have a habit of being in the the wrong place at the right time, I guess. I'm a geologist and oceanographer. I usually work in water up to my feet, my knees, and wetlands. But when the Hurricane Center at LSU, Louisiana State University, needed someone to lead a hurricane forecasting modeling effort, they came to me because I've been working on models that incorporate wetlands, and that's a lot of what the hurricanes encounter when they come to Louisiana. So we forecasted the surge in Hurricane Katrina and did it pretty well, and then subsequently was involved in the reconstruction of that surge event and the wave conditions, and then some of the forensics of the levee failures. We worked for the state of Louisiana on that. And then since then, I've gone back to my initial interest, which was in recreating and restoring wetlands. And that's what I've worked for the National Audubon Society doing that. And now I'm still an adjunct professor at LSU, but I have a private firm that I work through. And I've always wanted to see the Delta here, and I had a chance yesterday, and I'm really inspired by the landscape here. And thank you again for having me.
Good morning. I'm Ed Link. I'm a research professor at the University of Maryland in College Park. I'm on the honors faculty, the program project management faculty, civil engineering faculty, and the disaster resilience center. And other than that, I don't have much to do there. Prior to that, for 34 years, I worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, always in the research realm, so they always told me I never had a real job. But I was the director of R&D for quite a number of years before I retired and moved to the university. At the university, post-Katrina, I was hired by the Secretary of the Army to run the federal interagency investigation because I said it was bad to have houses behind those levees. So I was hired for the same reason you were fired. And a while ago, I was a part of the group, including Dr. Mount and Larry Larson, that wrote the California Challenge report in 2007 that recommended the 200-year standard for urban areas. In directing the interagency work in New Orleans, we conducted at that time the first large risk assessment of a large geographical area in trying to understand better what the risks were prior to Katrina and then what they were following Katrina, and especially what they would be with different alternative approaches to dealing with the hurricane flood hazard. For the last 5 years, I've been involved with the Netherlands as a member of their International Advisory Commission, looking at their long-term adaptation strategy for dealing with climate. And not just climate, but climate and their social and cultural changes that they anticipate may occur over the next 100 years or so. I've also been a member of the National Academy panel on dam and levee safety and community resilience. That was a very interesting blend of engineering and social sciences, looking at resilience from the community side. And I've been involved in a number of ASCE and other task forces looking at things like the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management, dam safety, critical infrastructure, and flood risk management. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Great, and thank you all. It's evident we have a very distinguished group of folks here to help us Continuing around the table with self-introductions, I am Randy Fiorini, the chairman of the Delta Stewardship Council. I've served on the council since its inception for 5 years. Prior to that, my background is in agriculture, where I still manage, when I'm available, a small family farming operation. I've got a few decades of water management and policy experience at the local and state level, and I am also happy to be here. Judge?
Good morning. I'm Frank Damrell. I'm a retired federal judge. I've been on the council now for a couple of years. I asked the governor when he told me that he'd like me to be on the council, what are you asking me to do this for? I know nothing about water. So I know about water is what I've learned while on this council. And I've learned a lot, but not nearly as much as you folks. And I'm looking forward to a very productive discussion this afternoon.
Good morning. I'm Mary Pifo. I serve on the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors. I'm in my 3rd term. I am a Delta resident. I live in the community of Discovery Bay, not on a levee, but on what's referred to as a peninsula. I'm chair of the Delta Protection Commission, and therefore I am sitting here and very honored to join all of you. I'm a founding member of the 5 Delta County Coalition, representing the counties of Contra Costa, Solano, San Joaquin, Yolo, and Sacramento counties, to work hard to represent the Delta community's interests and voices in the state and federal, along with the state and federal interests within the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Tatayan. I was appointed to the council, started serving on June 2nd, 2014. And I have to say that this council, the staff, has achieved an amazing amount of work in the short time that the council has existed. I've worked in California water policy planning and management for over 3 decades. Early in my career, when I was putting myself through school, there was this thing called the peripheral canal. And I got drawn into water policy planning and management. I worked for the Department of Water Resources, and then the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, went into private consulting and worked a lot with local government on integrated water management planning. And when I'm not working for the council, I work for the Nature Conservancy, an NGO. So I guess you could say I've covered a wide range of interests in water. And I'm very happy to be here.
I'm Patrick Johnston. I served 20 years in the legislature, and during that time I represented much of the Delta. I live in Stockton and was involved in creation of the Delta Protection Commission, and later served on it and the Bay Delta Authority, predecessor to the efforts generated by the 2009 legislation that led to the creation of the Delta Stewardship Council. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Peter?
Should we just introduce the folks here? Peter Goodwin. I have the honor of serving as the lead scientist of the Delta Science Program, Delta Stewardship Council.
I'm Dan Ray. I'm the Chief Deputy Executive Officer, and I have to confess that some of these folks from the Midwest and Louisiana are acquaintances from my time when I worked on the Mississippi. Got acquainted with them in the '93 flood and the other big floods we had in my era.
Good morning. My name is Cindy Messer, and I'm one of the deputy directors for the Delta Stewardship Council, and I oversee the planning division in the council, which is why I'm here, because the Delta Levee Investment Strategy falls under my purview, and my staff are, along with our consulting team, are taking the leads in updating the Levee Investment Strategy and the work that's involved in doing that. So welcome and good morning.
And with that, Cindy, would you like to remind everyone what the approach to the levee investment strategy is, and maybe if you could describe for us what staff hopes to receive from today's discussion.
Great, absolutely. So very quickly, I'd like to just run through the steps that we're undertaking to actually update levy investment strategy that's currently in the Delta Plan. And so just to remind folks that have been on this journey with us where we've been, what we're focused on now, which is why we have this panel here today, and just some information about where we'll head from here. So the approach we've taken with updating the levy investment strategy is to look at compiling a myriad of existing data and information, and that's ranging from information on all of the Delta islands and tracks, making sure that we've accounted for every island and track, making sure that we have the naming convention correct and whatnot. We've compiled information on the assets that are on each of those islands and taking a look at the categories of beneficiaries that are associated with those assets, with the protection that the levees afford in the Delta. We've also been pulling together information largely through our sister agencies and some of the key Delta stakeholders on levy conditions and configurations, and what are the risks and threats that are posed to the various islands and tracks and the levees on those islands out in the Delta. So I wanted to mention that because it's very key that everyone remember that we are not generating new information, but pulling together all of the good resources and information that's out there as we update our levy investment strategy. And then sort of tag teaming along with that, we've initiated a discussion about the state's primary goals and objectives and the state interests that a levy investment strategy should further. And this is a discussion that the council members are well aware of. We started this back in January, looking to put everything out on the table, take a look at what the options might be, and then move forward and obtain some guidance from the council members actually a couple weeks from now when we have our council meeting. But this is a key element, obviously, of the levy investment strategy. I should mention that the current strategy we have in the Delta Plan is very broad, has numerous goals, doesn't necessarily have a prioritization to it, but really the idea is that over time and with the available funding, we would seek to balance investments in those various goals. I'll swing back to this in just a minute. I want to touch upon some alternatives we created for the council members' consideration last month. But one of the reasons why we have this workshop today, and we're thrilled to have all of you here, is that we want to continue this discussion and are seeking your input and thoughts as we move through the workshop today on goals and objectives. And in addition to collecting information, having policy discussions, the project team, which is comprised of staff as well as our consulting team, is working on risk analysis element as well as a methodology framework for a levy investment strategy. So once we have a sense of the goals and objectives we're focusing on, how do we actually prioritize investments amongst all of those goals and objectives with limited funding? So what we've been working on is, for the risk analyses, is looking at different types of risks that are associated with Delta Islands, the Delta Islands and tracks, looking at this concept of tolerable risk and applying that to the region, and then of course looking at risk reduction options that might be available or should be considered in our investment strategy. At the same time, and I know Dr. Goodwin mentioned a tool that we've been developing. It's a key part of the methodology. It's a decision support tool that will allow us to take all of the good information we've been compiling, look at the risks that are out there, look at different options for investments in the Delta's levees, and using metrics that reflect the goals and objectives we settle on, be able to bring all that information together, look at the effectiveness of certain portfolios of investments in the levees in terms of meeting those goals and objectives, and especially where we can meet multiple goals, provide multiple benefits through single investments or groups of investments. That's what the tool will help us get a handle on. And I should say, we've developed a framework for the tool now. That process the tool itself is going to undergo a peer review process starting in April. So that's a part of this, this overall approach, is to make sure that what we develop runs through a peer review process, We come out on the other side with some very good recommendations. We're able to refine and fine-tune our methodology, move forward from there. Some of the future steps will be, after the peer review process, is to come back to the council and be able to generate some outputs using the decision support tool that allow the council to see the different types of investments. When we put those together, what type of benefits do we receive from those? Where do we get the most bang for our buck? How does that match with the goals and objectives that we've kind of narrowed down on and set our sights on? And it will allow for additional discussion and deliberation around what ultimately gets put into this new levy investment strategy or updated strategy. We'll be doing some CEQA, of course, documentation and meeting those requirements. And I wanted to, two last things. We're trying to also do as much as humanly possible stakeholder and public outreach and meetings. So we're getting out there quite a bit. We've got more meetings scheduled to try and, one, allow us to get some good input with local expertise from our sister agencies. We're having them look at the information we've compiled, vetting that through them. I think most importantly, just trying to be very open and transparent about this process and where we're heading with it and getting their input as we go along. And then ultimately the goal is to develop the levy investment strategy that has recommendations around types of levy investments, a prioritization scheme, how do we invest limited funding, but it'll also include recommendations for both structural investments but also non-structural. So we'll be taking a look at how does emergency preparedness and response factor into this, and other non-structural efforts, flood proofing and so on. And then I just quickly want to swing back to the discussion we've been having for the last few months about identifying state goals and objectives, and just touching upon the 4 alternative approaches that we provided to the panel members, we provided to the council and discussed with them at the February council meeting. So, and just for the sake of new folks that might be joining us, we suggested 4 different alternative approaches to guide investments, and they ranged from a business as usual approach, so the way we do it now, broad, lots of goals, balancing investments over time. We suggested there may be a business as usual 2.0, where we did a little bit of narrowing down. We said, well, maybe we would really focus on projects that provided multiple benefits, met multiple goals and objectives. We would take a more careful look at cost share formulas and different opportunities that might be available for cost sharing for levy improvements. We also, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. And then we'd also had suggested in this approach that we would take a more careful look at ability to pay versus the way it's set up now from the landowner's ability to pay. And then lastly, staff suggested that there may be a narrowing of goals and objectives under this 2.0, and that our suggestion, at least at this point, fell mostly into some of the Delta's place resources. So maybe recreational resources or things like aesthetics might not be amongst the primary set of goals and objectives. The third draft alternative that we suggested was based on the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan. Again, the goals were fairly broad and reflective of the business as usual, but the level of protection is higher under this scenario. So all of the Delta levies would be brought up to a higher level, the PL 8499 level. Certain areas such as small communities, critical infrastructure would be protected by what's called the FAT levy configuration. So again, a higher level of protection. This, of course, would be a more expensive option to implement. And I would say the one key point of narrowing under this alternative is in the ecosystem restoration facet, which is that it wouldn't be focused on setback levy options for migratory corridors, which is included in the business as usual, but it would be more focused on channel habitat restoration. So a little bit of narrowing there. And then our last alternative we call the goal-oriented prudent approach, which really narrows the goals down to protecting lives, co-equal goals, and protection of critical infrastructure that's of state interest. And under this particular alternative, The focus would be on project levies primarily and select non-project levies that were protecting those goals that we have identified. And I think with that,
Thank you, Cindy. That's a good overview. Now, we're going to begin. And Peter is going to launch into the first question for the panelists. I want to encourage my colleagues to interact with the panelists. And if they're not addressing an issue that's of concern to you, be sure and ask. And I want to encourage the panelists to interact among each other. So hopefully a free-flowing conversation that will lead to a half-hour break for lunch and then end at 2:30. So, Peter, kick it off.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair Fiorini. And what we thought we would start out with in the first hour is just to run down through the various expert panelists and to very briefly perhaps capture no more than 3 points. What are the real big lessons that you've learned from your experiences elsewhere that have worked well? And maybe somewhere between 1 and 3 pitfalls that we should avoid, just to see if we've anticipated and thought through some of these issues. And what I would suggest is the time is fairly limited. First of all, for the panelists, I know we're all academics or lecturers and used to speaking in 50-minute chunks. So I'd ask all of the panel members to be as concise as you can. And with the chair's permission, I think what we would suggest is that just so we get through this view of the experts to see where are the commonalities given the diversity of experiences, where are the overlaps, where are the differences. And we would ask the council members maybe just to, in this first quick run-through, to limit your questions to just clarification of the point that was made. And then when we get everything out on the table, then we would open it to the council for much more in-depth questions about what you've heard. So I think I'm going to be the timekeeper here, and maybe we'll give each of the panel members 2 or 3 minutes. At the most, just what are the real take-home lessons, the really big issues? What's worked really well around these issues that you've seen? And where have you seen these kinds of initiatives crash and burn? So maybe we'll go the other way around this time, and perhaps, Dr. Link, we could impose on you to start.
Thank you. At least someone else won't take my ideas. I'll still have my 3 ideas. You can copy them, okay. First of all, I'd like to applaud the council for taking this big picture view and exposing yourself to academics and also to science, because the policy and science communities just don't talk to each other nearly enough. So I really appreciate the risk you're taking and exposing yourself to science, more so than normal. So what have I observed? It's essential to have a big picture, a technically sound big picture as a basis for major decisions. Where has this worked well? New Orleans, the Netherlands, and recently the Corps of Engineers just put out a big report, a post-Sandy report on the Northeast called the North Atlantic Coastal Comprehensive Study. And in each case, there's a big, consistent picture of the issues and assets and stakeholders that are involved, that without that, it's really difficult to consider alternative approaches. So that's really important. Secondly, risk is an extremely powerful tool. We learned that in New Orleans. It was the only way that we were able to justify to Congress the expenditure of $14.7 billion to create a very robust and very conservative protection system, or risk reduction system in New Orleans. So risk is powerful because it allows you to weigh both the hazard, the chance of the hazard, and the types and severity of the consequences. So if you're just looking at the hazard, you don't really get to consider the impacts, and which I think is essential in your case, and I think the council is addressing that with the work that's being done on risk. The third would be it's critical to set the strategic goals and the azimuth that you're going to take for reaching those goals. But don't try to solve the problem in one bite. I think the strategy that the Dutch are taking right now for long-term climate adaptation, which is an incremental adaptation process where you understand the big picture, you make a strategic plan for where you're going and what you want to do, and then you implement it incrementally and you learn as you move into the future. And you don't make these huge investments that may, in fact, not be relevant to the future. But you plan for that incremental improvement. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that's, the Dutch are doing that very, very well. Top three that I wouldn't do: dilution is not a solution. I think you have to prioritize your priorities, even. In the Netherlands, they started out with, 5 years ago, with essentially the same list of multiple objectives and goals that you have. In November, when we looked at the new Delta program plan for the Netherlands, there were two really critical elements, and the other elements were still involved, but they were of, say, a second-tier priority because resources weren't there to deal with all five of them equally. So it's, I'm sure you're going to run into that exact same kind of an issue here with resources. Yes, yes. Sir, thank you. Well, I guess, and trying to serve everyone's desires is going to lead to no one being satisfied, and especially the state needs won't be satisfied. Keep science on your side, but don't let it be a barrier. It's important to have science on your side, but there's also a lot of expertise here, and a lot of these issues are more policy than they are science. And so you don't hide behind science if you don't want to make a decision. You have to make it anyway. And also, I guess the last thing is don't rest on the laurels of the current standards. I was part of the recommendation for the 200-year standard for urban areas, but frankly, that's not enough, because 200 years in the Delta is a few inches, not a few feet. And the uncertainty in all of these analyses is way beyond a few inches. So if you think you're really doing 200 years when you go a few inches above the 100-year, I'll guarantee you in the future you're going to be surprised that it's not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We had some interaction after Katrina, and Ed has been a wonderful teacher for our area. Now I sit as a commissioner on the regional levee board that deals with 3 levee districts on the east bank of New Orleans, and so this academic has gotten pretty involved in the rough and tumble, I guess you would say, and all those things are very good piece of advice. Now, I am, and it may be partly because I'm not so familiar with this Delta, but I keep hearing everybody talking about the levees. Is there more to it than levees? Are we talking about other structures? Are we talking about some grander goal for the landscape or for water supply? If everything boils down to levees, I think that's a fairly narrow view, because levees can only do so much. I think that flood protection is not a right. It's a negotiation. Basically, you have certain shared values between people who are personally at risk and people who are not personally at risk, but actually called upon to pay for improvements. So So it's important to be able to describe those other benefits out there, and to really focus. They're not an afterthought. They're very, very important because a lot of the people who will be helping pay for improvements in the Delta have never been there. They don't necessarily think of themselves as beneficiaries. They need to think of themselves that way, and whatever you can do to yeah, I guess on the levees, I just say sort of like SEC football coaches, there are levees that have failed and there are levees that have not yet failed. So, there's no, if there's a time passes in which a levee doesn't fail, then people become complacent, and that it doesn't mean that the levee won't fail tomorrow. I think the cause of Delta renaturalization, or actually, the Delta is a very modified environment now, but anything that can move in the direction of a more natural system is actually something that inspires support. Even in Louisiana, we have a major Mississippi River Delta restoration program underway. We're actually spending, $500 million a year almost in the last 2 or 3 years. It's not, I wouldn't call Louisiana a hotbed of environmentalism, but one thing we've really, I think people in Louisiana feel very invested in this effort. It's something that brings everyone together. It's a mom and apple pie issue, and it doesn't make any difference. We've had to pass a lot of constitutional amendments because the laws were obstacles in some ways, and so we go out to the people for those issues, and we almost always get about a 70% majority on that. So it's not a bad thing to go out to the people and go through that campaign, and because that builds a lot of awareness. But we do have a strong well of support that allows us to get over things that people see as impossible, like and usually these are pre-existing rights. In our case, it would be oyster growers' rights to lease state water bottoms, and these are rights that they passed. It only costs them $2 an acre, but they can be passed down through successions and whatnot. They're very, very important private rights in Louisiana, and so those things. If we can't always do what we need to do with the legal system staying the way it is. I mean, people kind of assume that laws can't change. Well, they can, and we have a state legislator here who can tell you that if there's a law that's causing a problem, then that it's not necessarily easy, but it can be overcome.
And actually, Paul, if you could wrap up just so we stay on time.
Very good.
Thanks.
This is a hard question because you've asked us to limit our speaking to 3 things. So I've been here changing my 3 things, and I've done that several times. Here are my 3 things that work. Number 1, relying on one approach to managing risk is destined to fail. There are different approaches or adjustments for risk management. They range from engineered solutions, land use solutions, building codes and practices, emergency management, disaster response, warning systems, etc., etc. An approach that's effective takes all those into account and comes up with an appropriate mix for what it is you're trying to manage. I think, looking back on 40 years of experience, singular approaches are like pushing on a water-filled balloon on one end. It certainly pushes the balloon of risk in, but it just comes out on the other side. And so to manage it so that the risk gets reduced, you need a multi-dimensional approach. I particularly like pointing that out to engineers. Second, in estimating what you're gaining, I think an approach that works is one that looks at consequence reduction. And consequences need to be thought of in a multitude of ways. One needs to look at not only the population directly affected, but also the systemic impacts on other populations. So it might be an island population, it could be the delta population, it could be the population that abuts the delta, and it could be the population in other parts of the state. I live in Palm Springs. Certainly some of the water I drink, although not all of it, comes from here. I'd like you to keep it coming, but that's a personal interest. But the consequences also include economic, societal, institutional, environmental, and when one considers making decisions about these approaches, somebody always wins and somebody always loses. And that needs to be dealt with in an appropriate way. Good luck. But also in looking at consequences, one needs to consider shorter impacts and consequences and longer term. Because sometimes you can have good short-term consequence reduction, but long-term consequence reduction is a different animal. And then one also needs to consider interactions with other hazards. I probably don't need to tell you about other hazards that you might bring to bear on making your decisions. They would include the Pineapple Express and certainly earthquakes. Another, by the way, taking a too narrow view leads you into trouble, is how it doesn't work. Last and third, let me say, in reading the documents I've read, in my opinion, you have a somewhat narrow and ill-conceived definition of emergency response. First of all, it's not defined. An emergency response can mean different things to different people. Yesterday I learned that it meant to some in our van moving rocks from that pile onto the levee. And then I also heard reference to the NIM system, which, by the way, California invented and the Fed stole and then forced California to implement. It wasn't as good as the original system California had. But that's basically disaster response. Two elements of emergency management, a better term than response, because response implies post-impact, is number one, public education. We know in this country well how to prepare, how to present, how to disseminate, and what the contents of effective public education for hazards are. Use that knowledge and educate the people. Second is providing people at risk, if indeed life safety is important, and I know that it is. It's not politically appropriate to not include it, so it has to be, as it should be, is issuing warnings to large and small populations prior to them being impacted by floodwaters so that they can move out of harm's way. One of the ways they can relocate is evacuation. Another way could be going to a top floor in a structure. And what might be an appropriate, there's a lot more actions that can be taken. And so putting in an adjustment or a strategy or a risk reduction measure, if life safety is an issue, about how to motivate the public to engage in self-protective action behavior is critically important. And extensive knowledge about how to implement that and implement it at the state of the art exists only a few miles down the highway at the Army Corps headquarters in Davis that just completed a project bringing all that knowledge together and a user's booklet that could be used by locals. So I guess I'd sum all that up by saying not taking full advantage of that which the sciences have produced about how to accomplish these objectives. Thank you for letting me speak. I have more, but I limited it to 3.
Yeah.
Rest assured, Dennis has more. It's good going down the line because I can not have to say half of what I was already going to say. Okay, so obviously a lot of what's been said, I think all of us agree with. The big picture is something you're working on, and trying to have that template to work underneath is the challenge that you're facing. And then once you start to do that, putting those priorities on it. As Dennis says, risk is probability times consequences. We've talked a lot about the probability. He talked a bit about how we can address those consequences, and there are a series of ways to do that. Myriads of them, I might add. We provide information to communities all the time on how to mitigate and the options they can do that they can try to fit to their community and their circumstance. And as he said, in doing that, your challenges are always who wins and who loses. So keeping in mind the 3 E's is important. You've got to address the economy, you've got to address the environment, and you have to have equity. That equity is always the sticking point. And that's what you're going to find here. And you've already found that. I don't need to tell you that. But it's who wins and who loses. It's, you know how it goes? It's like, do I want to pay for this? No, I'm not benefiting. It's the same old story, as the governor told me. You know, when it comes to who pays, it's don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that guy behind the tree. You know, that's what everybody's going to say. So you're going to have to think about how to make that equity in a way that you get them to buy into that share. And Dennis talked a bit about how you're going to have to try and convince people that they have an interest in this and how to do that. That's a bigger challenge. Getting that buy-in at the stakeholder level, keeping that system transparent. And when you end up with a system of priorities and projects that you might provide some of this funding to that you're talking about, you're not going to get the buy-in unless somewhere in that checklist or that possible list that they're going to see something that's important to them. It may be not on top, but somewhere in there they better see themselves. Because if they don't see themselves, they're not buying in. And that's going to be your challenge. And I liked what Ed said, to make sure that when you start to implement, nobody has the perfect plan. We've known that. We've seen all those around the country. But start and adapt as you go along. Gilbert White was famous for that, as you know, and one of his great discouragements was that we didn't do enough adaptation. We just simply implemented. And then 30 years later looked back and said, I guess that didn't work. You know, well, how about that? Combining that policy and politics is going to be your challenge, and science along with it. We talk, for example, a lot about levee standards and the 200-year and whether we have an adequate standard. Think about the $14 billion we spent in New Orleans. For what? 100-year protection for a city that's 10 feet below sea level. Seriously? Look at what you've got at risk, and you need to think about that. I think a challenge you're also going to face is, as I'm reading some of your material, it's like, well, if you have less than 10,000 population, you can get by with a lot less standard. Is that a way of saying that if your town has less than 10,000, you're less important? I mean, I'm thinking of those people in the town of 6,000. How are they perceiving this? That's going to be a challenge for things like that. So I think you've got a myriad of things ahead of you. I think there's some experiences that have worked well. But it all boils down to getting that everybody to buy in, that consensus. And that's, everybody has to see themselves in that picture. So it's a social issue. It's not an engineering issue. We can give you 10,000 engineering solutions. We know that. So with that, I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. It's very, very important.
Okay, Alicia.
So I'm going to offer the perspective of a practitioner of studies trying to solve complex problems in the area here. Some of them I think are fairly obvious, but I'm going to state them anyway because I think no matter how obvious they sound, they are afflictions that many of our study and problem-solving processes face and fall into every time, regardless. And then some I hope are a little bit more uniquely compelling. So 3 items that I think work, that I have found that worked, and I found out the hard way sometimes that these work, and that is a collaborative process and transparency is key. It's really hard to ever hit that standard that everyone agrees was transparent enough in hindsight. I think it was if you're able to successfully come up with something that can be implemented at the end of the day. But judging that and planning for that early on is really the challenge every single time we attempt any small or large scale undertakings. Another item, of course, is truly identifying and understanding impediments. Once you start understanding your interests and priorities, a part of that I think is really understanding the impediments that some of the partnering entities bring to the table, or the different entities that you're looking to rely on to help implement solutions. What are the impediments to maybe realizing their full abilities? And in understanding, so I'm talking about laws that don't exist or that are constraining in some ways, maybe not providing the full opportunities that some might think or some envision they could. Understanding policies and to what degree they're subjective and not subjective, to what degree they're not subjective. And really being able to understand what those impediments are viewed to be. And a risk I find is that when people think maybe they can influence those policies and they assume early on they can influence them to a greater degree than they ultimately can, that can be a big challenge and a high risk factor in solving a lot of the complex challenges that we're talking about. But understanding those impediments really leads to being able to strategize around them, strategize to resolve them. And I think that's all part of that collaborative process and discussion. I've had, as a third item, I've had an opportunity over the last 20, 25 years to closely pay attention to a large-scale problem-solving planning effort in Florida for the Everglades. And I think my last point of what works is really recognizing those moments in time where the stars align for success and recognizing how long of a window you have to really take that action. The Everglades has had a really, really good run, and it was because enough levels of interest in government from federal, state to local entity level, stakeholder level, aligned enough, long enough to make a considerable amount of progress. But even they, in a 20, 25-year effort, have been able to implement parts of what they envisioned, parts of what they identified, and their priority in the world is diminished because of changing conditions, administrations at all levels, priorities at all levels. They dominated in part of the president's budget for years, and that's just something that I don't think anything can hope to capitalize on for more than some finite period of time. So coming up with the plan that is implementable is key and critical and important. Understanding those priorities is every bit as key to identifying, to be able to truly be able to claim success at the end of the day by implementing enough through that window of time, whatever it is, when those stars align, to be able to get enough done that will have really made a difference. So I would just offer that. In terms of what I would not do, and this is, I'll start off with, I think, one of the more obvious ones, and it's the other side of the coin of the collaborative process. It's not to do things in a vacuum. It's very easy when you're faced with deadlines and funding limitations and sometimes legislated expectations to deliver solutions that we tend to, at the end of the day, feel that the only way we're going to get anything done is if we just go into a room and do it. But that, of course, is the opposite of the collaborative and transparent process. So really finding that balance is key, being able to make the progress in a collaborative enough fashion. how we explain policy and legal constraints matters. Doing it once, explaining our agency's abilities and capabilities and limitations once or once a year isn't enough. It is an ongoing, constant dialogue because laws and policies are complex. You know, technical guidance is complex. Really understanding these things is our responsibility at whatever level we're operating from to be the one that's really explaining, being the sort of the ambassador of that process and helping folks understand it and work with it. And then lastly, I think I would say that, especially operating in a complex, large environment, geographically large, technically complex from many, many different aspects, we tend to, I find that our visioning discussion, the unconstrained, what can we do discussion can leave a lot of expectations that can be hard to deliver on. Earlier in my career, I'd be a part of in a room with those kinds of discussions, and you get really caught up in it thinking, we're going to do great things, we're going to do different things, we're going to do things that have never been seen before. But then when we actually try to implement it, we start hitting those impediments. And being able to really understand those and be responsible in our messaging and responsible in our expectations shaping is really key. We are in an evolving time. The fiscal constraints that we're facing at all levels of government are very real. What that has translated to for my agency is a strict adherence to policy compliance amidst a time where we want to be more collaborative than ever. We want to look at more benefit categories than ever, but being able to reconcile the potential of what we believe we could do with existing rules is really our day-to-day challenge. So just sort of that, connecting that dialogue from the visioning of everything that's potential and getting it down to, and this is what your alternative process is looking at doing, sort of tying that and narrowing that down to something more attainable is key. But we are in evolving times, and I think the messaging and expectation setting and sharing is key.
Right, thanks, Alicia. Jeff.
I want to thank Alicia because in that last point, she finished off every single point that I intended to make. It was good. I was going to get to that one too, but no. So yeah, thanks. This will be actually short and simple because everything was touched on in some form or another. But I do look at you guys. You have a plan. You have the Delta plan, and devolving from that Delta plan can be this Levees plan. And that's because the 2007 legislation, the flood control legislation for the Central Valley, punted on the Delta because nobody wants to tackle this difficult, squirmy, tough to get your hands around problem. So they booted it in the 2007 legislation, and you got stuck with it. But you have a plan. So I think it would be great for you to devolve your priorities right out of your plan. Your co-equal objectives, define them specifically, and overlay that on how you set your objectives here. You have the foundation for that. So plans matter in this business as much as I detest the process of planning, which we seem to do endlessly. So I think you actually have an opportunity based on the 2009 legislation to do this. The second thing is, and this comes back to Alicia, is the unreasonable expectations. So I flip it over to reasonable expectations. To do this plan well, you are going to have to give people bad news. I don't think there's a person on this panel who thinks otherwise. And the earlier you can give them that bad news and the longer lead times they have to adjust to it, the less social and economic and perhaps even environmental disruptions that you do. So this is where the plan really plays an important role. I want to caution against the sound science problem, which you already heard here. The definition of sound science that I give is that's science that sounds good. And you're going to run into this in spades here. And we have, as I sat on the Independent Science Board for so many years here, we heard this year in, year out. Because the, how do I call it, no offense, the consulting university agency industrial complex lives on making more science. And science is a great way of avoiding decisions. You have to make some unpleasant choices. You have, I will state emphatically, being the enemy of all my colleagues, you have plenty of information. You can make the bigger policy decisions with the information you have. You can move forward with those decisions, but I promise you, in your next meeting, people will come up and scream and yell at you that we don't have enough information to make these decisions. So avoid that. So that's the sound science. I think you've got enough to go on. Last, I want to do a couple, and they were touched on standards. I actually have, from my time on the flood board, and I'm looking at Clyde McDonald over here, who's sitting on the flood board and has to deal with this all the time. Actually, standards are pretty useful. And in the sense they are the clearest expression of policy that government can give on things like levees. I mean, this is as clear as it's going to get. We have set these particular standards. The problem with standards is they are viewed as fixed. And so, for example, one of the proposals to bring everything up to PL 8499 standard, I think that PL 8499 standard is already way out of date. And as we are seeing rapid changes in climate go on, you're going to be constantly revising that standard. And I think people don't get that standard is a moving target, but they focus on that standard. And so be careful with the notion of overusing standards when you have things like rising sea level, changes in inflows, increasing temperature, which is causing increased rates of subsidence, of course, increasing earthquake. We just read the interesting review by the USGS this morning. Conditions are changing in this system along the San Andreas system. So standards should be viewed as something that can be constantly revisited and adjusted. I do want to, now that I have the federal government sitting next to me here, at the Public Policy Institute of California, we have tracked very closely. In fact, there's a nice report you guys might want to read called Paying for Water that we released earlier this year. We look very much at the federal involvement, and to be generous, the federal government is not very involved. Yet so many expectations are placed on you guys when you're sitting there putting things together that it's kind of like my science, geology, where miracles occur. I mean, we explain a lot of things in the rock record by a miracle occurred. That's the best explanation I've got for it. You're going to get the miracle is going to have to occur that the federal government is going to come in and save us by spending massive amounts of money for these projects. The Central Valley flood plan that's going on right now has a lot of miracles embedded within it. So I think reasonable expectations on funding, and one of them is that the federal government is not likely to come to the rescue. And by the way, that comes to that notion of a standard, bring up things to PL 8499. The underlying to that is that the federal government will show up when a disaster occurs and help out. And we've had some experience now on how that's working. The legislature's having to allocate $500 million for levee repairs because the federal government didn't come in and help. So the federal government is not likely to be a reliable partner. And then finally, my last part comes to the risk. Beware the sunk cost effect. The sunk cost effect is that we have made an investment in the past, and therefore that is a compelling reason to continue that investment in the future. And it is probably the single most difficult policy choice to make, is when to decide to no longer to support a specific activity in a specific place. And I'm just calling it the sunk cost effect, which is fairly appropriate in the Delta, I suppose. Is a metaphor or a pun, depending on how you put it. But it's something that I've noticed when we talk to both stakeholder groups and nonprofits and folks. We have done it this way. We want to continue to do this way. There's a compelling reason to do that. Well, actually, I'd beware of that. There is a lot of inertia, institutional inertia, that wants to keep things going the way they were. So I got it done on time, right, Peter?
Yeah,
that
was perfect.
That's a great presentation, and now council members, an opportunity to ask questions, make comments. Patrick?
Dr. Link, you spoke first of big picture planning, and others referred to it too, and then you spoke of New Orleans and Katrina. Did the picture come before the event or after?
Unfortunately, after. I think New Orleans was significantly unprepared, but not unknowledgeable that something like that might happen. And I'm not pointing at New Orleans proper, but everyone who has a foot in the water, with regard to that responsibility. And I think actually the big picture hasn't evolved until recently with the Coastal Louisiana initiative that Dr. Kemp mentioned, and the Corps' Louisiana Coastal Protection Restoration strategic look, that for the first time got out of the boundaries of New Orleans and started looking at the whole south coast of Louisiana and then ultimately the Gulf Coast. And so now there's a strategic perspective for judging where to do what in that region, but it's just been very recent.
Yeah, we had another little disaster out there that helped with the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. So, as Alicia said, you need to take your disasters when you can. They're very important potential windows, unfortunately. But I guess I would say, since when is the status quo as good as it gets? There seems to be, that comes from what Jeff was saying. The status quo is what it is. It's not necessarily that great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure how I can frame this appropriately, but I'll try. I'll give it a shot. I'm curious of the panel what your awareness is and your opinion is of the current state levy subvention program and what many in the local community see as a great success, and maybe the current dialogue and ongoing dialogue being a threat to the ongoing support from the state on local levy protection, both project and non-project. So I'd just like some input on the current levy subvention program.
So having sat on the flood board, there were many deliberations about that and the value of it. And since that time, I will personally state, I think this is probably the best investment the state can make, is to keep the subvention program going. This is, and the reason is the return on investment is extremely high because you're leveraging local assets, you're leveraging local knowledge. I just think the benefits, and I think we do have tangible results we can point to a decline in levee failures associated with it, the frequency of levee failures. Now, I don't know if I can actually back that up with any data other than the empirical observations, the reductions in levee failures. So I think this is actually money well spent. And it's not a lot of money. That's the important thing. So from my time on the flood board, I saw great advantage of it. And here's how it fits in. You have to make big picture decisions. I mean, we've been hearing that from the panel. You're making the big picture decisions. The levee subventions program is the small picture stuff. It's the individual farmer with a levee that they're trying to maintain in a specific levee district. I think keeping that going for now is a very, it really, in terms of state interest, return on state dollar, I think it's pretty good. Others may disagree with me, but I think it's had very positive results.
Come on, I'd like some other perspectives on it, outside of California, possibly.
Well, I gather what you're saying, let me make sure I understand where you're coming from, is that a lot of the locals like the way it is.
Well, the locals, and I know there's some in the room, I'm sure they will speak later, the locals see their levee protection being not only protection of their local property interests, but a benefit to the state beyond their own direct interest. So not only do they like it, they see a value to the state and to their community and to their own private property interests, that it is a collaboration, if you will, of success.
But in a way, do they like it because, what do I see on the average, they're paying 5% or something like this? I mean, it's really mostly state money going into it. Is that the part they like? Or, it's not clear to me what you're saying. They like status quo. If I'm not paying anything, I probably like status quo. Do they have enough skin in the game? That's the challenge I think you face, is do we make sure that we have some equity here? I understand the can we afford to pay issue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the tricky part, is do you do means testing? How do you figure out can you afford to pay?
Mm-hmm.
Question.
Well, and I think the issue is not isolated to a personal property owner, and we've had that discussion here, and it will certainly be a part of this moving forward, is what do the levees protect? Is it simply the farmer and his crops, his or her crops, or is it the entire infrastructure of the Delta, which includes rail and power and farming, of course, and highways, and there are multiple beneficiaries, which we are digging into. So there is that big picture. So I'm looking for input on what examples may be in Louisiana or in the Florida Everglades of where the states may partner with the local property owners to preserve and protect those levees for the benefit of the entirety, not just that swath of property that may grow corn or wheat or some other agricultural product.
I see a lot of variation in that as I work with levee districts and states across the nation. It really is. I mean, you find some levee districts that really step up to the plate, and if so, I think you find states more willing to help them. You find other levee districts that don't want to do that. So it's really a broad spectrum across the nation. And I expect you probably already looked at some of that, but there's probably some good examples from Texas to Louisiana across the nation that might give you some information.
Great, thank you. Alicia?
I think one of the things we need to really look at and take into consideration when we talk about levees, how they function, how they perform, is really understanding what constitutes a benefit. Any sort of benefit, quantifiable, monetary, social, economic, whatever. And is the benefit truly realized by the isolated activity? So when you talk about people and the production behind at one particular island, absolutely, the benefit is clear. When you talk about what resonates beyond that localized effect, that's where you have to really look and say, and look at the full risk assessment. And I'm thinking particularly about the critical infrastructure that is present in the Delta. And this is a challenge that we had with the Corps when we were doing a recent investigation in the Delta from this perspective, is the isolated fixes at the levees, at the levee locations, in and of themselves don't reduce the comprehensive risk to the critical infrastructure. When you start looking at what the investment is to really get at true benefits to the critical infrastructure, it's a much bigger ticket item. Mm-hmm. So those isolated fixes might contribute to the general trend of helping to protect the critical infrastructure, but you can't really claim that benefit fully until the infrastructure is fully protected, and that's a much bigger scale problem to solve.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm curious from the folks from Louisiana that after you got the big picture, what were some of the policies that proved to be impediments to big picture thinking and also on the ground?
Well, I think one thing that happens is that the big picture is not just an abstract. It becomes the reality. And so the thinking changes 180 degrees. And, when you have a perimeter levee system that protects a major city and where you can have a break in any part of that and flood the whole city, then people start to understand they're in the same, I wouldn't say boat, but they're in the same polder. And that's when you start to get a willingness to spend more. And I guess part of the mentality that the Dutch have, which is what they call the polder mentality, which is where there's much more of an understanding of the common good and how it's necessary to spread the costs around. And now, one thing is that in this Delta, we don't talk about too much the federal interest, but if you have a big disaster here, the federal government will be involved. And that's the problem with the sort of on paper working out what is the federal interest or the state interest, because that all goes out the window as soon as the disaster happens.
Yeah, I would add the difference from the past, for example, in New Orleans was, for one, there were like 13 levee boards. I know that seems like a small number to you, but now there's two, the one that Paul sits on and the other one on the West Bank. So there was more of a bottom-up perspective that created the environment that New Orleans was in 2005. Yes, there was federal influence on that, but even there, when things were recognized that should have been done, there were no resources available to execute those things, and so the status quo became the reality for New Orleans. I think the switch now is that there's a lot more top-down examination of the big picture, which does bring to play the organizations that do have resources, can write checks, can be partners. But it endangers the loss of that bottom-up perspective, and you're promoting the bottom-up perspective, which is extremely important. And that connecting tissue between those two views is sometimes not stitched together as well as it should be.
If I may contribute something to this question, one of the key roots to loss in the greater New Orleans area was prior to impact. No one was in charge. There was no systems viewpoint. There was no levee failure or hurricane czar. It was no one's responsibility to take the broad view. As important, remember I'm the sociologist, as important as a bottom-up approach in this is to involve the people whose lives are impacted by it, one must not miss that broad perspective.
I apologize for not being here for Dr. Link's presentation, but thank you for doing it.
Can we all provided self-introductions?
Oh,
Can
Phil
you,
Eisenberg.
disclose your credentials?
Phil Eisenberg, Vice Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, appointed at the same time Randy and Pat were appointed. Mayor of Sacramento for many years, City Council, State Legislator, lobbyist, and now general mucking around, like all of you, in public policy. My district represented a good slug of the statutory delta, three counties, Contra Costa, part of San Joaquin, and part of Sacramento. Anyway, I appreciate very much your agreeing to serve on this thankless panel, but so I'd like to give you my useless thanks for doing so. But you have, as I walked in, Dr. Kemp was saying, I just walked in and says, protection is not a right. And as a recovering politician, I understand that that is the most revolutionary statement to make in any discourse about levees and flood risk and so on, because the usual perception of most people is, hell, it's not a right, it's right. Now, I'm a lawyer too, used to be anyway. I understand the legal questions and implications are complicated, but I've been trying to figure out kind of things from the presentation that was made that we could take back to the duty. And one of the most interesting conclusions just from the listening to this brief presentation was that levees are merely one of the options and perhaps not the most important option. And if you understand that, you might have a starting point for this. And the second thing is, all of you were generously saying public policy kinds of things to us where normally you might expect us to be able to figure them out in advance so you don't have to say them. So here's the first public policy thing I've ever written. This was Dr. Kemp's statement. State guaranteed protection against the risk of flooding is not a right. Now that's the way I see it. We've talked about this before. That would be a sobering statement to make, although everybody on the inside, regardless of interest, understands it to be true. The second was the argument, use a range of options. Don't just pick your solution first, because if you do, you don't have a plan, you just have actions. And then third, Dr. Mount's suggestion to rely on the Delta plan is, of course, a reminder that we spent 3.5 years getting there and had a lot to say about levees, and we shouldn't lose it. But the fourth point that Jeff raised is, and several of you said the same thing, there will not be always, there cannot be a universe of everyone winning in a situation like this. So tell people the bad news early, as Dr. Doom himself. You did know that Mr. Mount was identified in the press as Dr. Doom at one period of time. Yeah, I think that's not a bad approach. What other kind of rough public policy things that we should already know that you haven't said, that you would say in those range of things? Forget getting to the levees for a minute and how to implement it and so on. Is there anything any of you haven't said that you think might fall into that general category?
Look for strange bedfellows. You know, find support from groups you haven't thought to talk to before. Maybe it's environmentalists in the Bay Area. Maybe it's other farmers elsewhere. But it's very important to reach out. I mean, we didn't necessarily see the navigation interest in Lower Mississippi as being potential collaborators with us. Right.
Yeah.
But now we do. And it turns out we have some common interests in terms of restoration and the future of deep draft navigation in the Lower Mississippi. So, so I'd say find those with whom you can make some common cause, and don't ever stop looking.
I'd like to add one. All values are not equal. Some values will have a larger impact and be served more than others. And to say something to the contrary, that all values will be served equally, I love the word equity, but there'll be no real equity, is misrepresenting how decisions will impact different players, from the individual homeowner and property owner right up through the values of the state of California and wanting to maintain its water supply that goes so far away. So the idea, as is represented on the flag outside this room, that all values are equal, is probably a misstatement.
Okay, which are the Dr. Mileti first priorities above all others?
If I got to pick?
You bet.
Human life.
Okay, all life everywhere. One person on an island, that island's entitled to be protected by any means without regard to cost forever.
No, that's not what I said.
Well, you just said it. Life.
No, I didn't say that.
Oh.
You added that. And addressing how to do that in terms of large population centers. If you have any that might flood in this state close to the Delta, I think you might, as well as large economic interests that could be impacted, both locally as well as systemically. Human life is the number one priority. I think the solutions you select should consider that first. Now, if there is wilderness with one home in it, and they own a boat, and the levee would probably break slowly, it's not a large cost to human life. But if there could be an event in which people could be flooded quickly, or by surprise, or after an unexpected, not predicted earthquake, for example, the preservation of human life becomes an issue. So it's not a monotone approach to it, but considering it in its variable manifestations.
I think you can hide behind risk a bit to answer that question.
Explain that.
If you are willing to define or accept some definition of tolerable risk, then from a societal perspective, not an individual perspective, then you are creating a policy that establishes some boundary that if you're, in simple form, if you're above the line, something needs to be done. And because it's based on both the frequency or the probability of the event occurring and the level of the consequence, you can weigh one individual versus 10,000 versus 100,000. You also weigh common event, a very common event that could relate in one fatality will equal a more rare event that may create 100 fatalities. So you do provide some cognizance of the issues of an individual if you're using that type of an approach. You are having a tool created that will give you an ability to take a look at these problems in that fashion. So that is one way of, risk is a very powerful tool from that perspective because it does allow you to weigh those things.
We had to address a similar question and come up with an answer in reference to seismic safety in the state. And one of the approaches was the Uniform California Building Code, which requires that structures built in our state are built that, and let me just say this as a social scientist, they don't collapse and squash people in earthquakes. It has nothing to do with the structure is still functional. So there's a minimum standard that most of the time in most earthquakes delivers that promise, which is why deaths are as low as they are in California earthquakes. Not that they're eliminated. If there's a counterpoint like that, and then other decisions could flow from that. Now, do you implement that differently on an island with a small number of people than an area that could be flooded that has a large city? Probably it would be implemented differently, but it's some common reference.
This is you are talking about don't do things directly that you can do indirectly. Impose a building code standard for safety because you can't simply tell 12,000 people living in the heart of the Delta that they have to bring their houses up to the highest standard.
No, I wouldn't suggest doing that regarding floods in the Delta with existing structures. And then it's not just the structural solution. You can preserve life by providing people with adequate warning so they get out of the floodwaters before they reach them, which could include going to the second floor of their home. It's not just a structural solution to life, making life a top priority.
Why do you, I was involved for 3.5 years with a state Blue Ribbon task force that kind of led ultimately to the 2009 legislation. We spent a considerable amount of time talking about the notion that you have to be able to get to the roof of your house if you want to, or at least to the second level to be able to be protected, or that you at least ought to tell people who live in a floodplain that they're there and they ought to have a boat or whatever in the dickens they do. Without exception, that was viewed as frivolous activity, if not antagonistic, and there seemed to be more sympathy from government agencies to funding a public education program. Tedium and boredom was my summary of it, than actually meaningfully and in direct ways telling people that they live at risk and they ought to fix up their life.
Those are two sides to a three-sided coin. I'd like to begin talking about the third side.
Right.
And that is how you get people to do that when their life is at risk. Although public education should come before, family preparedness should come before. But 90% of that human behavior is motivated by the information people are provided during the event in a warning. And so this would be providing them with that information to get them to go to the second floor before the floodwaters hit the day the flood's happening, to the extent that that's possible. And as California is anticipating having an earthquake early warning system where people have 6 to 20 seconds of warning prior to severe shaking, delivered over mobile communication devices. If there is cell coverage in the Delta and if people who live there own cell phones, that kind of information can be provided to people almost instantaneously from the moment of detection if the detector has the authority to press the dissemination button. But that involves a large effort regarding emergency management and planning. It wouldn't happen by accident.
Patrick?
So, for the federal government's perspective, is the narrative simplified that New Orleans and that region flooded badly, the federal government spent a lot of money, and most of the focus was on protection of life and property. And one of the corollaries of that was a determination that where there was flood risk that would involve the federal government's expenditure in the future, such as the California Delta, that levees ought to be stripped of vegetation to improve viewing how safe they were, thereby reducing the environmental or ecosystem values to those levees, but doing so as one of the lessons of Katrina and one of the judgments by the federal government that it would reduce its risk.
I'm going to try and respond to the various points I think you were asking me to touch on. So yeah, in New Orleans, I think the decision was made that bringing the city up to a standard was in the federal interest in an atypical process, not in a typical investment decision-making process. The decision was made and it was funded, at least from the federal side. The sufficient funds were made available. That was a commitment the federal government decided it needed to make, and at that point in time. Investigating the causes, and I should disclose, I'm not an expert in the detailed analysis, the forensics of the New Orleans issue and failures there, but the Corps has attempted to learn from the information that it's been able to collect with other agencies and try and reinforce and reemphasize levee safety policies to avoid and minimize risks of levees failing. And the levee safety policy as it pertains to vegetation on levees is very much a part of that. I would say it's very much an evolving process, and it's fundamentally intended to help reduce risk that a levee could fail and reduce the sort of invisible aspect of risk associated with levee, meaning the risk that people can't see from the inspection process, annual and multi-year inspection process. So I'm going to pause and ask you if I'm getting at the basics or where
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what I thought. Okay. But our challenge, and Jeff referenced it in the Delta Plan and the legislation that compels that the plan consider the co-equal goals, one of them being ecosystem protection and enhancement, that focusing on protection of life, for instance, which surely is everyone's highest priority, is not sufficient to execute our mission to deal with the environmental improvements called for in law. The federal government has moved, I think, and Dr. Link, perhaps you were there at the time too, towards, well, we're going to protect life and property along the way, but the environmental protection just falls way behind, and the impact on California puts a practical federal policy, however evolving, a bit at odds with California law and our mission, which is more complicated, and that is to do levee improvements for the protection value while also improving the environment and the ecosystem in that same delta.
I want to point out, Patrick's raised a really important question that we are going to revisit after lunch. It's one of the three questions that are going to be posed. So I might suggest that maybe, Alicia, you complete the answer to Patrick's question, and Dennis, if I can ask you to push pause until after lunch when we take up this particular issue.
Randy, you can do whatever.
Okay, thank you. I like him. All right.
I would add, the Corps, our piece of the federal government, has a mission to do ecosystem restoration as well. So balancing our internal our agency policies with our other agency policies is one of the, I mean, that's the essence of the challenge in a lot of the investigations that we undertake to resolve some of the problems in the area that we're talking about. I'll just say that we have, at face value, the conflict is, it seems like it's easy to see the conflict. What I have found after a number of years of discussion about the policies and the philosophies and the concerns is that when we deal with site-specific, case-by-case basis, we are able to work through them in a way that we can resolve flood risk through levee improvements while being cognizant and careful to meet our obligations as stewards of federal resources as well. So we're able to work collaboratively with our non-federal partners and the resource agencies to work through the concerns that dealing with the vegetation on levees presents. We don't have silver bullets yet, but on a day-to-day basis, we're slowly working our way through it. So.
Susan?
This is on a whole different track. I'm curious in the Louisiana area, after the forensics and the recovery, has someone actually tracked what was spent in terms of recovery, and if so, what were the categories? And then the third part of that is, if you have that information, is that information included in the future when you're computing the benefits to be derived from augmenting and improving the system? Do you include those avoided costs in that computation?
I can tell you that the initial risk analysis that was done for the New Orleans area only had available to it direct cost. So we had direct public infrastructure losses, we had direct commercial, industrial, and residential losses. But basically, the data were how many structures of different types were flooded, to what depth, and what was the extent of the monetary losses for the contents and those structures. And we did that on a census block by census block basis. And that was to a 2005 economic base. After 2011, there was another risk assessment done for the purpose of looking at resilience, and that means armoring the levees so that they're less susceptible to erosion from overtopping. That risk assessment had a new economic database that was brought up to the 2011 timeframe with regard to what was actually in New Orleans then as structures and their conditions and their values. But it was done at the zip code level as opposed to the census block level, which is quite a lot grosser, larger chunks. So again, that incorporated mostly direct losses, but there were secondary analyses done looking at the total cost or the indirect losses as well, which totaled more like $200 billion instead of the $30 billion of direct losses. So I think those estimates were made for both situations, the direct, which is the more traditional way of calculating the risk, but also realizing that the direct only was 10 or 15% of the total. So the more meaningful numbers for the future are really the total losses. It's just much more difficult to capture those until after everything's over, unfortunately.
I would just say that most of those techniques don't capture human life. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they don't, but we did a life safety risk analysis as well. We had, at the census block level, we had demographics for the region, including not only the number of people, but their gender, their age, and so on. And we ran a model called LifeSim that made assumptions about evacuations, made assumptions about availability of wheels to get out of town, and so on. And we estimated loss of life from Katrina, and then for a variety of other scenarios post-Katrina. So that was a second set of risk maps, which is very important because it gives you a completely different perspective. The loss of life risk numbers look very different in pattern from the loss of property numbers. And in fact, as Dr. Mileti has said, the way you approach saving lives is quite different than the way you approach saving property.
I'm going to take one more question from Judge Damrell, and then we'll break for lunch.
No, there's a combination of thoughts here, and I don't want to take up time because everyone wants to have lunch, but much of your thinking was impacted by Katrina. Is that a fair statement? But we're hearing today about risk factors and about the combination of factors we should take into account. In large measure, we're impacted by Katrina. Is that a fair statement?
I would say that it's certainly a big marker on the wall with regard to lessons learned or lessons not observed. Well, we're talking about levees and flooding in the worst drought in the history of this country. And that's hard to get everyone's attention over here at the Capitol. We're talking about levees. And we know that there's other risks out there besides rain and flooding. You have earthquakes. And I noted yesterday we went up to a risk of the major earthquake. An 8 and above earthquake went from up to 7% chance of probability. That would have been front page news, I suspect, in an era, another era. Maybe not, but it didn't get much attention. I'm sure it got your attention. And that seems to be one of the big risks that we're facing. But nevertheless, what I see is when we talk about levees and flooding, I think most Californians that don't live near the Delta see that as a local problem. It's a local risk. It doesn't necessarily deserve state funding. So a combination of those factors that I just mentioned, and maybe we'll wait for after the lunch to answer them. I'd like to get your thinking about how you assess a risk that's viewed as local. How do you assess a risk that is viewed as remote, even though earthquakes would be a significant risk for this Delta for a lot of people, including the entire state of California? How do you measure those risks and convince folks that need to pay the money to make that happen, the levee improvement? How can they be better motivated to do what needs to be done? It's going to take state money. We know the federal government doesn't react until after the disaster occurs, so that's not on the table. It's primarily going to be local. I mean, and state money that we're going to have to use. Maybe that's too much to swallow before lunch.
So panelists, the level of your hunger will determine how quickly you respond.
Let me respond quickly this way. You've asked a sociological question. How do you change human perception? The answer is we know to the extent that it can be accomplished how to do just that. And If you'd like to know what that would look like, you'll have to wait until after lunch.
Fair enough. Where's lunch?
I think on that note, we will break for lunch. For those of you that are here in the audience, it is acceptable to bring food back and consume it here. We're going to take a 30-minute break, and we will reconvene at 12:30 here. I'd like to reconvene the meeting and welcome Jessica Pearson, our Executive Officer. Jessica, thank you for joining us. Jessica had a very, very busy morning, but is going to be able to be with us now. I wanted to begin where we left off. Judge, would you reset the question that you provided that Dennis is so eager to answer? And then we are going to tee up the final three questions, and we're going to have to try and be briefer, more concise with our answers this afternoon than we were this morning. So, Judge, the question.
I'm waiting to hear, excuse me, thank you. I'm waiting to hear Dennis's response. But it was essentially a kind of risk before the fact, risk assessment before the fact, namely the disaster, and risk assessment after the fact, which I think are different concepts. I suspect, at least that experience creates different attitudes with respect to risk assessment. And then, of course, the notion that we're living in an era where we may not perceive the risk to be significant. The drought, for example, or flooding, but earthquake may be increased significantly, although I don't see any big discussion about that, but I assume that's the case. And how do you get everyone to buy in to the risk assessment if they think it's local versus statewide? How do you get the state to take that attitude, which I think is a little different variation of some of the same question, basically the same concern that I raised. Does that all make sense? Great.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you for the question. Let me answer it in three waves. First, it begins with how the human being is wired. Human beings don't believe they're at risk to high consequence, low probability events. It's true regardless of the hazard. It's as true for earthquakes in the state of California, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, as it is for people living close to or in the Delta, as it is for any other hazard anywhere around the earth. It's almost a cultural universal regarding human beings. So we're beginning with that. And your question fundamentally is, how can we take that kind of human animal and alter how they perceive risk? Second wave of answer. There are disciplines that are now 30 and 40 years old called risk communication and crisis communication that have had armies of researchers doing research investigating this very topic and very issue. What's the risk people perceive, and how can it be altered such that perceived risk and objective risk can be brought closer in line? The Department of Homeland Security, since 9/11, has invested millions of dollars in trying to nail down some, as based on the status of knowledge today, what we know about that. And it depends on, first, your approach can be and needs to be customized based on what it is you seek to achieve. So if you're interested in altering perceptions, there's one set of strategies. If you want to alter behaviors, there's another set of strategies. And perceptions and behavior are not the same thing. And so let me answer it in reference to, substantively in reference to perceptions. It depends on, number one, writing a message that's appropriately worded, that contains the appropriate content that science has documented are the factors that human beings pay attention to that can alter their risk perception. Second, and remember, I'm not talking about behavior now, I'm talking about perception. It's addressing how that message is communicated to them. Let me give you just a very brief, I mean, this whole thing is very brief, but let me give you a sniff of what some of the findings are and some of the lessons that are in hand. Communicating risk to a person by having people talk in jargon, by doing it in a non-systematic way, by having earthquake preparedness events once a year, doesn't accomplish anything. However, having the information packaged as an ongoing stream of communication over time that has no beginning and no end is how you can capture the human interest and alter what people think. Plain world example. Coca-Cola knows how to do this well, not in reference to risk, but in reference to selling their product. Coca-Cola advertises its product every day and has for over 100 years. And when they stop advertising, people stop buying. So they're interested in selling the product, and so they engage in ongoing communications. Anything less than that doesn't matter. In reference to the difference between flood risk in the Delta, which I have no data on, so I don't know what that is, or for that matter, in the state, there's not much there's not much difference in terms. Let me surprise you. We did a statewide sample survey to measure earthquake risk perception and what people have done for earthquakes to inform policy and practice in the state to upgrade preparedness for pending great earthquakes in the Bay Area and in Southern California, the two most likely great quakes in America. And we were able to determine that the people in San Francisco, despite all that community's efforts, in the Bay Area, despite all those efforts, and in Southern California, despite 20 years of public education, don't perceive the risk of earthquake any different than people who live in the safest seismic zones in the state and haven't done anything more to get ready for them. So wrap your mind around that. I'll bet you if we measured the flood risk, it would be the same. That's because what's been put in place historically to change those perceptions and behaviors haven't done it in an effective way. However, California, with all its great wisdom, has revised its approach to public education and outreach for the earthquake hazard based on the most current knowledge and findings. And a plan is being implemented by the State Office of Emergency Services out of its Caltech office. That's the state of the art. And so if one wanted to review a plan that had all the current best practices in place, you've got it, but it's about earthquakes, not floods, but I presume that could be easily adapted. Does that answer your question?
It spilled over into my other questions, but no, well done. Louis, did we were talking at lunch. I thought you had some thoughts.
Yes, thank you. You had a concern about the ability to calculate a risk number that would be relevant to people outside the Delta.
And to funders
and
of the levees, yeah.
Right. And calculating that risk is not an issue for the traditional loss of life potential and economic potential, even the indirect, but you have to make some judgment calls about what those indirect costs might be because they're much fuzzier, much more variable and uncertain than the direct cost. It's really easy to say I've got 12 buildings lost and what they might cost. It's hard to do that with regard to how many jobs might be lost or how is the economy going to be affected. And then you start looking at the problem or the issue of, okay, what's the risk to ecosystems? What's the risk to social, cultural assets and so on? And now you're getting into territory where there's not a established practice. We did all of that in New Orleans. We mapped individual neighborhoods and what types of services were lost and not lost and so on. But we stopped short of trying to create a risk map for social cultural risk because we had no precedent. We had no methodology we could point to and say in the short time frame we had, this is a credible way to do it, and therefore we're going to put that out to the public. We published all the information, but we couldn't publish a risk number with regard to that. So you're in that same realm with regard to the non-economic and non-life safety areas, but quite a bit has been done to kick that can down the road a bit and to begin to create a practice in those areas. But you will definitely be a pioneer in that area as you apply it to the Delta. And as far as communicating or including the indirect impacts on, for example, Southern California, I think that should be eminently feasible. But again, it's murkier than counting what happens in the Delta.
Yes.
Dr. Mileti, is the adjustment of behavior attributable to anything other than the public education campaign and altering perceptions? Or are there tests there that you should tell us about?
It depends on what kind of behavior you're talking about.
25% of people who live in flood-prone areas have flood insurance and 75% don't, and the numbers aren't increasing.
Because, which, by the way, is good. They're going down for earthquake insurance in the state. So regarding the sale of insurance, one of the shifts that the California Earthquake Authority recently made, informed by social science research and advice, was to market insurance, since you asked about that behavior, purchasing it, built on basic human values, rather than explaining how horrible an earthquake would be and hoping that that horror convinces people to buy earthquake insurance. And in fact, doesn't. It turns them off. And so if you pull up the California Earthquake Authority, the first thing you'll see on that page is the following quote. There's a picture of a young woman sitting against her sofa on the floor in the living room, watching her 1.5-year-old baby run across the floor like a 1.5-year-old baby does. And it claims the following: peace of mind, no earthquake can shake. And that goes right to the heart of the fundamental human value that would lead someone to the value being valuing your love and the life of your child, for purchasing earthquake insurance so that you can rebuild a living room like you're sitting in after an earthquake happens. And so we'll see how that approach works. The evidence suggests it would work better than having the USGS describe how terrible the Hayward Fault earthquake is going to be, or how monstrous the next great Southern California earthquake is going to be, which they've been very vocal at doing.
Let's talk about other indirect steps. People who live in floodplain areas should have boats. Any evidence on that?
If I understand your question, evidence that people in floodplains should have boats? I don't know of any evidence to suggest that.
The New Orleans, I remember when we were sitting on the Blue Ribbon Task Force, Ray Seed, who some of you know, teaches at Berkeley, was part of the post-Katrina evaluation. He said, well, most of the people who were saved in boats were saved by private boats. They weren't saved by government boats or government efforts. A remarkable thing that I had not even given a thought to, but is particularly important in areas where evacuation is either impossible or, in New Orleans, delayed beyond the possibility of happening.
Evacuation in New Orleans was actually quite effective. The majority of the population wasn't there when the impact occurred.
But for those who were there,
why they were there is the critical question. And that was an emergency management failure, sir. I reviewed under a microscope the state of Louisiana's emergency plan. I reviewed the evacuation plans of local hospitals and institutions where people who are sick are, or people that are I'm beginning to enter the age category, living in assisted living, so on and so forth. And I literally listened to every single radio and television announcement over multiple days in preparation for litigation against a murder trial against a congregate care facility that didn't evacuate. If I may, I've got to tell you this. The trial went on in a rural Louisiana courthouse that had bullet holes in the front in the brick from the Civil War. I mean, it couldn't be more nostalgic than you could imagine. The critical question was, why didn't the people who didn't leave? And that was an emergency management failure, stepping over, when you talk about preservation of life, looking at an engineered approach and ignoring the emergency response and warning procedures and response. Most of the people who didn't evacuate were in a racial island, disenfranchised from the rest of the community. The levees broke the last day before their welfare checks arrived. They had no money to put in gas. The mayor of New Orleans was asked by the train company, would you like us to take people out in the train? He said no. The mayor of New Orleans was asked by the people who had school buses, would you like us to take people out in school buses? The answer was no. And what was missing in that is the perceptions in the emergency manager's minds were that the levees weren't going to break. And therefore, the flood that they were facing would be able to handle people who were staying behind, and that the Superdome could take care of it. Well, you saw on TV what the result of that misperception was. So that was an emergency management failure. The lack of people leaving who didn't leave.
Okay. We could be here for a couple of days. There's so much information to share. Peter, moving on to the last three questions, I'm going to suggest that we've adequately covered the tolerable risks assessment, and that whatever else is necessary will probably come out of the other two questions. Cindy teed up the four alternatives that have been presented to the council that we're asking now these folks to respond to. So as the guiding light for the remaining questions, why don't you tee up the next one, and we'll try and get through them.
Sean, if I may,
efficiently.
Mr. Chair, we're running just a little bit behind schedule. What was your thought on the time frame? We'll go in half an hour each question.
Yeah, we'd like to wrap this up at 2:30, so I think we've got essentially an hour for more conversation, and then we're going to need 30 minutes to summarize, wrap up, and take public comment.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. So as the chair said, Cindy gave a very nice overview, and you've seen the four alternatives that have been developed by the staff. And so the question was that this was an initial attempt really to put, if you like, bookends. One was the business as usual, the business as usual. Version 2, alternative 3 was economic sustainability plan. The Delta's fortress option. And alternative 4 was the goal-oriented prudence approach. And we were just going to seek your thoughts and guidance. But do you have any recommendations for additional alternatives that should be considered, or changes to these existing alternatives that should be considered as we go forward refining these? And I think that in the discussion over lunch that we'd also ask you to remember that this should be viewed from the perspective of furthering the state interests. So we are just looking at part of this, basically the state investments, rather than all of the other potential things we heard this morning, particularly look for strange bedfellows, make the coalition as wide as you can for greater buy-in and also greater diversity of funding sources. So that was the question before, and I'm not sure, do we want to go the other way this time, or... Yes. Let's do that. Jeff, are you ready to go?
So I'm going to, I may just be too deep in the weeds on all of this, because the answer is all of the above. When you look at 1 through 4, you're going to have elements of 1 through 4 if you're going to stick to what I suggested originally, is building it out of the Delta plan. I did. You're seeking black and white answers in here, like that there should be a bright line between all 4 of these, and I don't see it. Oh, really? I figured everybody would appreciate that. So, okay, so now you can hear me. So in my response to this is that is really actually more straightforward than that. It stems from what I said earlier. There is a plan. There is a Delta plan that you spent years producing, and I think that the choice of this should devolve directly out of that Delta plan. I mean, there was a lot of work put in on that, and a lot of policy goals were there. So I suppose that points toward alternative 4 as likely evolving out of the Delta plan. I think, but I couldn't really tell. I couldn't understand. So I'm not being very helpful, because I didn't really actually understand the differences between these as I went through them. Perhaps maybe some additional narrative on these examples would be useful to people. It's not that I didn't do my homework. I read it. And I went, I don't know. Is my simplest answer. But fortunately, Alicia knows all.
Who?
Thank you, Dr. Val.
I think the alternatives cover all of the possibilities and give you flexibility, and it really just comes down to that difficult challenge of identifying the true interests of the state. I mean, from a public safety mission to agency, all the alternatives cover that as a primary objective or goal. So I can just say that's I think paramount. But in discussing and studying the Delta for years, it is so complex and it is multifaceted, and I think it's going to be difficult to whittle away any of the different purposes or uses in the Delta. And it really just comes down to that very difficult values-based discussion and decision-making process that the state has. I do suggest that you be cognizant of potential other interests in terms like federal, just so you have an idea as to whatever path you ultimately are going down, what the likelihood is and the order of magnitude of potential federal participation you have. But I mean, this is the epitome of a complex, multi-objective operating environment, multi-stakeholder operating environment. Understatement, yeah. I'm just taking a look here and see if I've thought of anything else.
What I was suggesting, let's pass on, because there'll
Sure.
be an opportunity. We're going to open it to the council members for questions. So, Larry?
I agree with a lot of what Jeff said about not a lot of differences between these innuendos and so on. But I don't think anybody on this panel is going to say you missed some huge alternative. You've used the 2000. How many years have you been looking at this issue? And you know your local issues. So to expect that we're going to say, "Gee, you missed the silver bullet here," is not going to happen. I am concerned again that, as Jeff said, that if you take these out, I'm not sure that the people you're going to be talking to see any huge differentiation. Maybe you've got ways to explain they are different. I'll tell you what I'd like about a lot of what I read in a lot of your reports, doesn't necessarily show up here, is that you're taking an attitude that we better not count on the federal government to come in and bail us out. We better figure out how to do this. And you're absolutely right. You better. I deal with Congress way too often. And I tell you, it's getting more and more difficult to get anyone in Congress, let alone the Congress we have today, that's going to provide a whole bunch of money to you out here in California to help solve this issue. Yeah, will they come in after a huge major flood event? Sure they will. That's not going to solve your problem. What you want to do is get ahead of it, and that's what you're trying to do, and you should be doing. So I like what you've laid out. You may want to help distinguish them a little bit more, but I think you're headed on the right path. And if you want to know where you've covered them all, you do that by talking to the stakeholders and say, what have we missed? You're the ones living with this. You're the ones going to pay for it. What do you think?
Thank you.
Let me begin by saying ditto. And it all fundamentally boils down to that which you implement. Which values will be served and which ones will be lesser served. And it's making those value judgments and coming up with a tool that enables you to come up with judgments that honor as many of those values that different stakeholders have as is possible. But the bottom line is there will be losers. And having a logic to defend that is probably a methodological point that you might want to be sure to be able to point to. So, for example, if one coded all of the islands in terms of significant variables and then made decisions that were island-specific in terms of different outcomes, and then did the same for the Delta as a whole, and then did the same for the state as a whole, you might have some data, theoretically, you could call it data, to refer your judgments to. But this is a value decision-making exercise, and it's not going to be easy. And you have all the stakeholders' keen attention, I'm sure. Good luck.
I guess my first question is, how dissatisfied are the stakeholders? Are they ready to make a change? Is the status quo not okay? Or is it perceived to be fine? And then the other, kind of keying off what Dr. Mileti said, what is a positive message that we can go forward with? That is, if we're talking just about levees and just about whether we've got 200-year protection on levees, that is probably pretty boring to most people outside of the Delta itself. If we're talking about California restoring its major estuary in the San Francisco, Sacramento, San Joaquin, that is something that people can get behind and over a much larger area. So you're essentially, you've got a positive image that you're for the future. And by the way, you can take care of a lot of those levee problems with, because you can perhaps find other funding sources for some of those things. It may be it's hard to find funding for levees, but it's not necessarily so hard to find funding for dealing with endangered species and things like that. Something that occurred to me when I was driving around, or when we were driving around yesterday, was, I'm kind of amazed at how narrow the crowns are on these levees. And I know that there's an interest in fattening them a little bit. And I was thinking, gosh, that's where you put your bike lane. you know, for, you know, and you have campgrounds and you have people coming to the Delta who didn't come before, and what an amazing, experience that would be. If they've got to be on the road with everybody else, it's not so much fun. But at the same time, then you can, if you increase the width of the crown, you can add your berms and so on, and you end up with a better levee, and there can be some renaturalization that goes on in these corridors, and so that was just a couple of thoughts.
I guess my first question back would be, when would you expect to make the decision on which of those alternatives that you would say, this is our strategy? If it's right now, I think you're playing night baseball with no lights, because you don't have all the information you need to make that decision now. I think the tolerable risk information and the decision support tool, if it conforms to what you really feel will be helpful to you, will go a long way to provide the information that might allow you to make this kind of a selection between those four options. But then laying that all on its side, the desirable approach might be quite different from one island to the next. And I'm not sure a one over the world or one size fits all strategy is what you can afford to adopt and say, this is what we're going to do on every island. This is our approach. And so these things we've decided not to do are off the table, and yet one of those things may, for one island, that may be the only thing that's important. So I'm not sure you can down select. If you're going to do an analysis island by island and have a customized strategy for which of the islands are both acceptable for or have the ability to do environmental enhancements and ecosystem enhancements, and make that a part of the strength of the levee system, and make that part of the safety process, make that part of the guarding the water supply, so you have a 1 + 1 + 1 = about 10. That's going to be an island-by-island decision, so I'm not sure breaking it down into one of these is feasible as a strategic approach to dealing with the problem. I think you have to keep I think I'll repeat what I said earlier. You have to prioritize your priorities, and then gain more insights through some of the good work that you've already got started to provide support for doing that, so that you can customize from a cost-benefit ratio, from a feasibility ratio, from a needs perspective, what will fit and give you the most bang for the buck for each of these situations.
Thank you.
Great comments, and you were all very succinct and direct. Thank you very much in the interest of time. Council members, questions? Phil?
Let me just ask you to reflect on that a bit. Assume that we have received, and as we have, scientific information that, as far as I know, universally suggests to us that one of the major causes of environmental degradation in the Delta is the creation and existence of levees and the channelization of rivers and streams. Does science have anything to say about how you would set up a judgment standard, assuming that's a true statement, that would allow you to go through and make evaluations that you would protect a levee at whatever level, if you also knew that at its core, it was causing many of the environmental problems you seek to cure?
That's why you're getting paid the big bucks. That's a great question, and it's also a great dilemma. I think science does have considerable amount to say about characterizing what will degrade an environment or an ecosystem versus what will enhance it. If you get in the situation of improving the channel next to the levee versus and getting rid of the levee, it's just a matter of really, in the end, it's a hard decision, but you have to look at what is that doing to my overall risk portfolio, which means risk to life, risk to property, risk to the ecosystem. So if you don't fix the channel, then you're increasing the risk to the overall ecosystem, and so on. So that's the balance you have to achieve. And I think one of your biggest challenges is going to be determining collectively how you're going to value these different layers of information. How are you going to combine the information about loss of life and economy and ecology and water supply? How are you going to combine those? Because they're not going to look the same. They're not all in dollars. They're not all in acres or hectare, or acre feet or whatever. They're going to be in different dimensions. And so the challenging part of this is how you compare those and weigh those in your valuation of the total perspective, the total portfolio.
Well, you started to do some of that on Marshall Island and a couple of others. Setback levees make a lot of sense. And you're doing some of that incrementally. Because at the same time, you create more habitat on the riverside. And that was the big issue. Where's the levees? Right on the bank of the river. No habitat left, which is why the big argument about you got to leave the trees on the levees. If you had setback levees, you can accomplish a lot of that. But getting to there means landowner cooperation, all the rest. They've got to see where that buys into their needs as well as buying into the whole system needs and that ecosystem need that we all see. But it's whose ox is getting gored and trying to get them to buy into that process.
And I think that also goes back to understanding what the goals are that you're trying to attain. Pre-development conditions generally isn't on the table, but really getting definition around the goals you're trying to attain and then what kind of balancing has to be accomplished between those goals. When you know what the goals are that are on the table, that really, that you're trying to attain, that really drives the options that are on the table to attain them. If you're looking at co-equal goals, maybe it's a setback levy, between flood risk and ecosystem.
I think we're going to cover this subject in a second, but let me be just very clear on this. The biggest mistake you could make. Nah, that's not true. Okay, one of the top 10 mistakes you could make in this system is to come up with a plan where you say we will give priority to projects which have multiple benefits, including ecosystem. It's blank. That is a mistake when you have 1,100 miles of levees, 1,100 plus miles of levees, a system which is no longer native. It's now a novel ecosystem, which is nothing like we can't compare it to anything in the natural record. Then you cannot get to the scale that you want. This is the key thing I want to say. We've written about this extensively, as you guys know. We've written 2 books about this. Scale is a major problem in here, and trying to get to scales that function at the ecosystem level. Where you would make a better choice is to say we will have a few geographic areas in the Delta where we will look very closely and favorably at multi-benefit projects that produce ecosystem benefits. A setback levee is damn difficult to do in the central Delta where the land is 25 feet below sea level. It just really gets hard. Whereas in the North Delta, where you've got, you still have variable flows, you still got a good stock of native species that exists within there, setback levees are a lot easier, a lot less expensive. So you get a higher return on your investment with less social and economic disruption in the process. So I would encourage you, as you are setting your priorities, to not say, again, don't think of the Delta as one single place. The brain of Peter Moyle, for those who know, he was California's preeminent inland fish biologist. The brain of Peter Moyle, we represented in a map back in the Comparing Futures, that book that we wrote on this. You should look at the map. I think that map is a great map for deciding how to prioritize where you would make those sorts of investments. And it turns out to be pretty small compared to the rest of the Delta. And then I just pull the rest of that out of there, that it's human life and it's protecting property and protecting the water supply. Those priorities dominate. But concentrate your ecosystem development. You get ecosystem benefits. You get the greatest return on investment when you concentrate them. Every biologist I know, and I'm a geologist, but I play biologist on TV, everyone I know goes at this, the whole they call it patch dynamics, that you have to have these larger connected patches. And connectivity is the most important thing. So please, I would encourage you, don't think about blanket statements that say multi-project benefits will be favored. Do it geographically. It'll be much more effective.
So, Frank, and then Pat.
Excuse me.
As a follow-up
Right,
to something Jeff said earlier, Jeff, you said that the program of state cost sharing with local reclamation districts had yielded good results and was positive and ought to be continued. Given limited resources, so the bond measure that was recently passed, taken all together, you might over a period of years see $300 million of state investment in levees. Local investments would be added to that, but depending on how you calculate the need, it's $1.5 billion to $3 billion or more. So your suggestion here would be there are some environmental opportunities that might cost more per linear mile but be worth doing even while focusing on protection of life and property in a more traditional way. If you only had 10% of the money you needed, how would you allocate it?
Me personally, you want me to set the priorities?
I do.
I do, okay. But we only have till 2:30. I mean, again, I think the Delta Plan sets as the co-equal goals as a policy of the state of California for the co-equal management for reliable water supply and ecosystem health. I think you start there. That is a painful thing to say to the people who live in the Delta, and I mess around a lot in the Delta on a boat, and I love it, but that's where you start. So you start by saying those are our priorities. And so as you go through those two priorities, those are where we're going to prioritize our investments. And when it comes to the water supply issue, which we really have not tackled here, and I suppose we're going to do it later or what? I mean, this is a thorny, difficult, for you, this is really tough. I mean, first of all, you have the looming Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which, for all we know, may be going down in flames as we speak. I don't know what the outcome of BDCP will be. But regardless of what happens with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the levee network is essential to the state of California, regardless, because of the two. Sorry, guys, this is too deep in the weeds for some of you, but there's the notion of doing a peripheral tunnel, an isolated facility, depends on still having a levee network. To reduce saltwater intrusion into the Delta. So there's state value in making those investments. But what we know from the modeling that was done for BDCP and before BDCP and in my own shop is that not all islands and all levees are precious when it comes to that. That in fact some are much more strategic than others. So as a prioritization, I look at Randy and I say, okay, look, we want to get those levees done. I guess I'm doing number 4, aren't I? We want to get those levees that are absolutely have the highest state interest. We want to make some investment in. Well, there's also a great state interest, as stated by the 2009 legislation, in improving the ecosystems there. You cannot improve them everywhere. Nor is I think you're going to get much for trying to do it everywhere, but if you concentrate your efforts, you actually are also helping your water supply issues, presumably because you get better ecosystem performance out of the Delta. That's where I'd start if I were sitting in your shoes. And then, of course, you have the other aspect of this, the Delta as place. I still don't quite understand what that means, even though it's in the language, an evolving Delta as place. But that's your sort of third priority. And again, though, from state interest, the state's interest lies at the co-equal objectives as described in that legislation. So now I only have 10% of the money. I got to make some pretty tough choices.
So the sociological view would examine what stakeholders who, as Dr. Kemp and others have pointed out, are important to figuring out how you assemble a basis of support and ultimately public funding to do some of these recommendations. The exporters of the Delta, the water reliability part, are interested in fortifying those levees that are helpful towards moving water across the Delta to the pumps. And to the extent that the system changes, that still will be necessary, as you pointed out, if it did change with tunnels. Local reclamation districts and property owners are principally interested in protecting their islands and their property for agriculture or for urban uses. So that's their primary interest. The ecosystem improvement are much talked about, but not the focus of anybody's economic self-interest.
Their cost of doing business in the Delta, we can't ignore that. But the ecosystem is a classic case of there's broad public interest in that the public should pay for it. There should be expenditures. On the levee side, this is the strange partners or whatever the phrase we were using. Well, the water exporters, it is very much in their interest to hold that system together. They are not making direct contributions to it. It seems to me they should be supporting that. And of course, that's a multiple benefits thing. If you own an island in the Delta, or you're a levee district in the Delta, and your island is important to water supply there, you benefit from that. So again, this is this very difficult dance you guys have to do in all of this. I don't want to sound insensitive to the people who live in the Delta. I'm actually thinking there are ways to make it work for most of the Delta by looking at these broader interests to the state. But I'm also making clear I don't think it's like the status quo. Not all islands. The Fortress Delta notion. I don't think there's a compelling state interest in something like that, and that's you guys have to deal with that with the limited money you have. But the ecosystem, that's public. That's a public interest.
Thanks, Jeff.
We're here to advance the co-equal goals. The problem politically is that those goals are not equal, practically speaking. The vast majority of Californians care about water and getting water. That's just a fact of life. The ecosystem is important. Protecting the folks in the Delta is important, but not as important as getting water down to Southern California or the Central Valley. That's just a fact. That would be their priority. I'm not saying that's, I don't agree with it in any way. I think that the co-equal goals are co-equal, but, and with other goals we have in the Delta. But what I'm curious, suppose the Mississippi flowed north, and you were, and all the Delta levees in New Orleans failed, and the folks and farmers and folks in Seattle and St. Louis and Des Moines and Minnesota and Iowa got no water. They all went broke. They had disasters occurring. Well, that's kind of what we have here. You're easier to deal. You've got a confined situation in New Orleans because the water is coming down that way. But if the reverse were the case, you'd be facing what we face, politically, certainly, if not in a natural sense. So my question is, given that the facts that we have, they're not consistent with what you face in New Orleans, what do you think you would do with your priorities if the Mississippi was flowing north? Because then we can measure, apples and apples, right?
Yeah, I have to say I've never been asked that question. But I can tell you the Mississippi does flow north, at least briefly during hurricanes.
Well, you know what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
I want to know what your priorities would be and how you would analyze the situation as a result of your experience with Katrina. If you live in California, where the folks south of us want water, and the Delta water. They claim it's this much their water is our water, or the Delta folks' water. The same would apply, I think, if you had the farmers or the folks in St. Louis or Des Moines or elsewhere in Minnesota, whatever, were raising cane because the levees failed in New Orleans.
Well, we actually do raise cane in Louisiana, but yeah, I think the closest analog I have is right now the Missouri River has all of our sediment to rebuild our delta in the tributary dam systems on the lower Missouri. You know, they're all managed for local purposes, irrigation, flood control, things like that. There is nobody there to say we want the sediment or that we need the sediment. That's it's a little different from water, but it's a commodity that we desperately need. I guess I think we've got to make clear the connection between ecosystem restoration and water quality and reliability. I think there are arguments. I have a superficial understanding of this, but I think there are arguments that can be made that way that perhaps are not clearly articulated.
You know, just the thought I have is that we're talking about the state interest, and we're talking about funding these levees. I mean, until you can establish that these levees are critical to the flow of water. I mean, for the political interests of folks south of the Delta, you have a hard time funding what we think is important for the folks in the Delta.
Well, I mean, what Jeff said makes an awful lot of sense to me. That that if you can carve a piece of the Delta out for ecosystem restoration, where it's you're really going to do something there, and make that a project that everybody's invested in, then that allows you to do a lot of other things around the edges.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I have some questions and comments, and they're going to be scrambled a little bit because I'm going to go through my notes, and there will be some thoughts, Cindy, to pull out as well. I want to first of all thank the panel. I'm a little prematurely of the close, but the information has been extremely helpful and valuable. Identifying and then ultimately informing the beneficiaries, which was brought up earlier, I think is critical. But how we get to that identification is still something that we are struggling with. I certainly appreciate and value the emergency response and emergency management element of the discussion. I don't think we touched on that enough in our own experience and responsibilities. We've heard a lot about Louisiana, but we need to think about that as it relates to the California, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta. There was a highlight of social equity. And it was touched on briefly. We're talking about humans, we're talking about property, and we're talking about an economy and an environment, but I'd like to see in our efforts moving forward some discussion around social equity. Back to the one man on an island, is he less valuable than a city next to the Delta? I agree collaboration and transparency is key, and that all stakeholders should be involved, included at the table and represented, and hopefully we will have that through this process. Instead of referring to beneficiaries as beneficiaries, there was reference to the common good, and I like that. I think it's more relevant. Beneficiary sort of, to me, automatically equates to a financial investment, which may ultimately be an outcome. But when we look at it as the common good for those that benefit from the structure or the infrastructure of the deltas and its levee system, I think the common good might be a better way for us to identify who receives that value. Back to those that are at the table, the bottom-up perspective, and Dr. Mount, I believe you said it, being extremely important, those local voices, I couldn't agree more. I don't know that the state guarantee flood protection is not a right. I do believe or agree that there are personal responsibilities, but I think that's an outcome that hasn't yet been determined or possibly what we are working on. I believe that the Delta and its levee system will never be risk-free no matter who you are or where you live or what your investment is. We simply don't live in a perfect world in any capacity. So what I see before us is how we mitigate that risk for all key stakeholders, residents, beneficiaries, the common good, and balance that with policy and funding ultimately. And I like the reference to the California Building Code and how it relates to earthquakes. And maybe that's another example, Mr. Chairman, of how we develop our priorities with levees or how we approach it from a policy perspective. For example, there are buildings and infrastructure that meet new earthquake code standards or the new law, but there are many that don't, including local community hospitals. And there is an acceptance that a local community hospital can function and exist while not meeting current building code standards as it relates to earthquakes. And maybe we need to look at that possibly as how it relates to levees and their infrastructure. Peter, I'd like to ask you if the tour for our panelists included the South Delta. Were they able to see any of the existing fat levees that we have in our Delta environment? Cindy?
Yes. It did not. Given the time we had, we made it as far out as Sherman Island, taking a look along the way at project levees and different types of non-project levees. But
I know we often have too little time and too much to show.
Absolutely.
But I would certainly like to have maybe on a future discussion or make sure that we're giving apples to apples comparisons when we're talking about fat levees, that we actually can show that we have some within the Delta. And I think I asked this at the last Delta Stewardship Council meeting, but I think a map of the Delta, and this is really fine-tuning, and I apologize, probably work-intensive, but to see a map of the Delta that indicates project levies, non-project levies, levies that have received state subvention funds, where we see that revenue and where it's gone, and then possibly a separate map with economies of scale, if you will, regarding ag production, infrastructure, et cetera, so that, back to building priorities, we can't build them if we haven't identified them yet. And I think we're still struggling with identifying the priorities within which we then need to build the priorities from. Mm-hmm. Is the status quo acceptable? Absolutely not. And I don't believe there's anybody in the Delta communities that would say yes. Absolutely not. From ecosystem, environmental, or economic conditions, I don't think anybody would state that the status quo is acceptable. But those same locals that possibly or probably would agree with that still would like to have their interests represented in the discussion and the policy that moves forward. I don't know how much input we're getting from local landowners. And I know there's people that we hear from, and I know there's community outreach where we go out into the community to hear from them, but are we really getting that local landowner input? And maybe we could do a survey. Maybe we could do a mailing to property owners within the Delta. Do we have access on our website for survey for people to log into to identify what, as a landowner or a farmer within the Delta or a business owner, what do they see that they need in support from the state or from our efforts? What do they say is strengths and weaknesses? And how far have we, or how deeply have we dug to gain that information? In current conditions versus worser conditions, we may not like what we have as far as the cities that have been developed and the communities that have been developed, but it is our present set of circumstances. And we really can't, we can't ignore it. We can't wipe it away. We have to live with it. We have to deal with it. We have to manage it. And I think that lends to the complexity of the problem. And I would like to see the Peter Moyle map that Dr. Mount referred to for the basis of priorities. I think that may be another way we can help build some basis for our consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think we've entered into somewhat of a summary council member expression of what has resonated this morning. So let's continue on that vein. And Patrick, if I could ask you to start, and along the lines of what Mary just did, just share with us some of the things that have resonated with you, what you've heard today, and if you have any, if there are gaps or any additional questions for the expert panel, fire them off. We had a couple more questions involving the ecosystem functions, so that I believe we haven't fully adequately addressed that question you had. And then the other was assessing tolerable risks. I'm going to try and incorporate those two questions, Peter, into this summary, what's resonated.
When will we hear from people who want to address us?
We could, if
you might think I'm stalling, but
my thought was that we would go through and identify the things that have resonated with us. Ask of the panel any last questions that we have right now, and then call on public for comment.
So there's a lot of emphasis in opening remarks about having a plan, and it matters. Sometimes it comes after a big event, and sometimes hopefully before. And I think given California credit for trying to wrestle with this on the front end, and the reference and analogy to seismic work, I think was helpful too. And while the summary efforts to say these are 4 ways of going, you said, gee, there's not much detail there, that's too helpful and everything. Staff is trying to wrestle with things that we've kind of pushed them to try and do, and those need more work. But I think, in fact, as Jeff talked, he found himself working himself into one of the options that he said weren't real options that you could evaluate. And the reason you end up thinking that is that while I agree with Mary that no one's satisfied with the status quo, there are people invested in the way things perform now, the process of doing it. And one of them, my impression, and that's why hearing testimony would maybe reinforce it or put the lie to what I'm about to say, which is that we hear that Delta reclamation districts think the process of conferring with other engineers at the Department of Water Resources about how to rebuild and improve levees with a state-local match works. And if there would be more money allocated for that, we could continue to reduce the incidence of levee failures and continue on a practice that is built on 2 assumptions. One is that all levees have value, and secondly, that if a project is ready to go, the state ought to fund it. So it's kind of a practical way of moving money out. And we should continue to do that. And when Department of Water Resources testifies, since they're our sister agency and we work with them and they're essentially funding this effort through money that they put together, it feels like they kind of agree with the locals, that they'll go through this exercise because the law called for it, but they'd just as soon have the money, have their expertise, work with the local engineers who know the reclamation districts, and just keep doing it. And by setting up a bunch of standards or a grand plan, and trying to figure out priorities on top of priorities will make it more difficult for them to do their job. And there isn't a great benefit to be gained from it, because every time we add a variable, like we got to worry about the environment, even while we worry about export water, while we worry about protection of life and property, by the time you've said all those things, you don't have a software tool that you can push the button and figure out what to do next.
On to that. I agree with you that I think there are a lot of the people in the Delta who think the status quo is just fine. A lot of them are the levee owners. The reality is that there's a good share of those levees that are going to fail. On a sunny day, they look fine, and they've been there 40 years without a problem. Gee, New Orleans said that same thing, didn't they? But on a big event, you're not going to just lose one of them. You're going to lose a scat of them. And then your problem is going to be which islands are we going to pump back out and restore? And so as long as it's that kind of tolerable risk thing. I don't have any skin in the game. I can tolerate all the risk in the world if I think you're going to bail me out at the end. And in some ways, I think a lot of them do. Oh, if we have a failure, we'll get money to rebuild, and we'll on and on and on. So I'm concerned that there's not that perception that they're really at risk. I think Mary talked about that a bit, as you did you. So, if there's a bunch of things that have to happen, then I like the fact that you both, I think, articulated a lot of those. I think the equity issue is, you're kind of saying the same thing. One life is no different than 10,000 lives. There may be different tools, however, to address the one life than there is the 10,000. So you just apply different techniques in both places. So that's a way you can address that. The ecosystem functions, there's a lot of new tools to evaluate ecosystems that are around. It's been going on up the Northwest and the East Coast. Even the Corps is doing a bunch, as are other agencies. So I think there are some ways to get to it, but it's that, how do we get people to accept their risk, and that they need to buy into this is, I think, your biggest challenge of all.
So just to sum up, what I did get, in addition to a plan has value, and it has to be a sophisticated plan that accounts for the various goals you have, that stating those clearly in this process and as many others matters, and that on I thought it's interesting, emergency management, which we've spent some time on and will probably spend more, and figuring out multiple strategies to deal with that protection of life in particular and property, I thought was a strong point of it. And in a practical sense, maybe because Jeff's wrestled with this in official capacities as well as a researcher, the idea that if you have multiple goals, I'm beginning to wonder if we've asked Arcadis and those working on giving us sort of a computerized way of figuring out priorities is realistic. But on the other hand, assigning some amount of money to environmental projects in some locales while continuing to support at some level the program of subventions that has worked generally, while expecting those who benefit from the water exports to pay for reinforcement of the levees important to water delivery, may be the kinds of buckets we look at. There was a predecessor study, the so-called DREAMS study, that wasn't completed, provided considerable information but no conclusions that anybody agreed on. And we may end up there too if we try and get a tool that is going to be able to point us to a place on a map and tell us what that priority is compared to some other.
Judge? Mary?
Thank you. Just quickly, because I did go through my list already. When I referred to my request for a map of the Delta indicating the project levies, non-project levies, and some of that other criteria, I have recalled my own request at the last meeting when we had the tour was of the restoration projects, both government and non-government. And maybe it's in the works, Dan.
All that's being worked on. Yeah.
Excellent. I appreciate that. But that if we can add this to that list or that to this list, because the reality is these environmental habitat ecosystem restoration projects are extremely valuable, and they typically have broad-based support, including at the local level. The Dutch Slough project, for example, which is in my district, which is a great project. It's 20 years, maybe a third of the way through, close to $60 million in cost. The permitting alone, process alone is extremely extensive, and to say ecosystem is going to be ecosystem restoration is going to be a silver bullet, it's extremely expensive, lengthy in time frame, and very bureaucratic. And so it's important that we have the tool to look at to see what projects there are today, maybe plan projects, and have sort of a historical background of what the time and cost is to some of those projects, so we can have that as a reference point when we want to talk about that piece as being critically important, which it may be, but it does have associated issues or impacts with it. Thank you.
Frank, any comments?
But I looked at my notes, and the first comment was made by Mr. Link that struck me. A couple of comments. I'm just going to look through my notes. And that was, he said, you're going to start with the big picture. The big picture here is California. That's the big picture. And I'm struck with another comment. I don't know who made it, but somehow it seemed to capture that idea. And that is, if you can't see yourself in the picture, there's no buy-in. So the folks down wherever they are, I mean, the people in the Delta have to see their picture. We certainly know that they do and they should. But the folks in Santa Clara Valley and county, the high-tech industry has to see their picture. The folks in the Central Valley, the folks in Southern California have to see their picture. But otherwise, there's no buy-in. So the whole point of this exercise, if we're going to develop a strategy that makes sense to build the levees that ought to be built, everyone has to see that their value, their picture in that process, in that plan. And a plan that is not viable, that doesn't have that buy-in, politically it's dead. And we're not interested in dead plans. We want things that are going to proceed and going to be effective. And so I don't know, Jeff, like everyone else does, but I kind of like your comments. I think you were right on the money in terms of the notion that whether it's ecosystem, water delivery, protection of the communities, whatever it is, people have to see their picture in that effort. And to the extent they don't, we're not going to be successful because you're not going to have the political support you need. It's going to cost money, and we're not going to get the money. So I think in terms of a strategy, the strategy has to be realistic. It has to have a big picture concept to it, and it has to have a notion that there's something in it for everybody. And I think that's true if we play our cards right and we develop a strategy properly outlining what is really important for everybody in preserving and developing a strategy for the Delta levees. But I think if we don't do that, doesn't matter how well-meaning we are, or how good ecosystem development is, or whatever the case may be, all the individual pieces could be very valuable in and of themselves. It gets back to something I think Dr. Mileti talked about is value. What do you value? And make sure the values are meaningful. I presume in this case, those values mean something to the participants in the process, which means everyone in the state of California. That's kind of my general thought.
Just a prefatory question. Nobody's mentioned urban growth except in kind of passing. Is it useful from your perspective to increase the number of people in flood-threatened areas from any view? I mean, I'm asking that because if you don't ask the question and get an answer, it seems to me it's hard for us to develop strategy. And I understand there's an argument, well, yeah, you get a lot of people in, you have more money to pay the local cost share. I got that. Does anybody want to argue that it's great? Okay. What I found helpful from your presentation is the fact that we have to start from generalized public policy principles first, then work our way towards some understandable methodology that applies those principles in the discrete areas in which we're talking about. I kind of like that. And I've been tinkering for 2 years fruitlessly to do it, but if I were to do it today, I'd probably say that the primary condition for state involvement in significant flood protection efforts, and I deliberately say flood protection efforts, would be to prohibit further urban development within the boundaries of the Delta. It being inconceivable to me that the state would like to fund higher levies permitting urban development in areas that they really don't want to spend any money if they had their choice, and then be shocked and surprised to find out that all of a sudden the cost from a levee break has increased because you put 10,000 houses behind this levee. So I'd probably start there. I'd also, on the ecosystem stuff, I'd probably recognize that a lot of this discussion is accelerated by the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the tunnel discussion. And one of the things that interests me is, this is my shorthand, the theory of the Bay Delta Conservation Plans, the tunnels, is that if you build more efficient conveyance of water through the Delta, in the current configuration, it's tunnels, in exchange for a major protection of up to 150,000 acres of restoration or protected land within the boundaries, that you'll get higher water quality for exporters, a more reliable supply, although not necessarily more water, and arguably better status for fish. Now that's the argument on BDCP, which means the dilemmas that are, or the questions that are unanswered are out there. In the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the payment for restoration and environmental activity is separated from those who receive the benefit of water reliability. This is Jeff's argument, the public benefit, the public ought to pay for it. But the public funds to pay for it are nowhere in sight. I mean, just nowhere in sight. Everyone says it'll be done. There is the increasing problem of salinity, exacerbated by the drought, but present on a regular basis. Declining fish species and urban sprawl is just kind of moving into the Delta slowly. And so I look at that and I say, how does levee maintenance and improvement fit into that puzzle? Because that puzzle will drive the water reliability and the ecosystem in this larger context. I think you've been very helpful, believe it or not, in, for me at least. No, that's not true. That's not true. I think, Dr. Kemp, you just argued the thing. It's not a right. I mean, I know it's not a right. It's not in the Constitution. A statute is not a right. It's a statute, for God's sakes. It can be changed at a drop of a hat, although politically it's troublesome. I understand you sign contracts, you have contractual rights, but they're not eternal, endless, God-given rights. They're different things. And I like the idea, Jeff's idea, you commit funding for multi-purpose levee programs in areas, and I'd say identified in the Delta Plan as the most likely areas for restoration and floodplain protection. And I think we identified six of those areas, which I'll bet you are not much different than Peter Moyle's maps, Jeff, in your earlier publication. I quibble with this one, but I thought it up and I might as well say it. Because we're in the situation where increasing state planning about levees has a tendency to imply to judges like himself that, gee, the state's responsible for this. And so part of me says that the state ought not to assume legal responsibility for anything without a specific, clear, and unequivocal legislative enactment saying we assume the legal and financial responsibilities. But my lawyer hat suggests to me that won't work. But I don't know. But then the last thing is continuing the discretionary funding, as Pat and Mary suggested, is probably a useful, certainly it's not much money. Yes, it makes reclamation districts happy, but happy is a relative term. But the key word there from the state's perspective is it's discretionary money. It is not an entitlement program. And there's always a tussle, when we had our big Proposition 13 in 1978 that reduced property taxes by 30% statewide. And the legislature bailed out all us local governments. We adopted the slogan, a bailout once received becomes an entitlement. And that's kind of the way politics works in America, according to me. But Randy, I just want to thank him again for, you cause us to think, which may not lead to good conclusions, but is a useful process.
We're not done yet. For those of you in the audience that would like to offer public comments, there is a blue slip of paper on the table to my left that Keith has. If you haven't already filled one out, fill it out, and we'll take you in order. And then we'll, following the public comment, we'll do a wrap-up. Mary?
Can I make a brief comment, Mr. Chairman, before you introduce your public speakers? And one is to refer to staff's report for the meeting. Sorry, looking for the date. The February 26th meeting. It includes reference to the state subventions program, indicating that over the 20 years of the program, $338 million has been invested, with a range from 75 to 100% of total state funding with local cost share, of course. And I just broke that down to a per year cost, which I came up with $16.9 million, if my math is right. And if the Delta and its resources serve 2/3 of the state, and through the subventions program, we're funding it at near $17 million. And that $17 million affords the water delivery system for, again, 2/3 of the state, and the billions, multi-billion-dollar economy that generates. I think that's a good value of that investment. And I just thought I would throw that in. Thank you.
Okay, public comment. Eric Ringelberg, local agencies of the North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Council, and esteemed panelists. So Supervisor Pipo took most of my general comments, so I'll narrow things in. Very robust conversation. I greatly appreciate the time and energy and the insight that you've brought to this process for us. Local Agents North Delta represents reclamation and water districts in the Northern Delta, and we've taken a look at that prioritization table, and we've come up with what we think is a slightly more revised table that we feel is more reflective of the law and our understanding of alternatives, in order to provide a roadmap of how the council might consider investments writ large. My final comment is, it was very poignant for me to hear Dr. Mileti's comments today, because I have requested since the council started in the ISB, the Science Board, that a social scientist participate as an active member in both of those groups, because it's a refreshing perspective. I'm an ecologist by training, but we work with the engineers, and it's great to have a robust engineering conversation, but it's significantly more additive to hear from people who have a sociological perspective, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Regine Reynolds, South Delta resident.
Thank you. My name is Regine Reynolds. I live at 4444 West Undine Road in the South Delta. It's the upper end of Roberts Island. I've been out there all my life, and my family's been there since 1899. I'm wearing two hats today. First of all, I'm going to speak on behalf of Restore the Delta, a 14,000-member nonprofit group representing Delta interests. And we are in full support of your third option which is the Delta Protection Council's take on Delta levees. So now I'm going to take that hat off and put one on as a South Delta resident. I am the human animal who fully recognizes the risks where I live. And I'm going to say that again. We fully recognize the risks where we live. I was pleased to hear Dr. Mount endorse the subventions program. It's working. Our levees are in better shape now than they have ever been historically. My third comment is, I cannot believe that you came to the Delta and you did not come out to Lower Jones Tract and look at our fat levees. It's being done right now. It was a cooperative effort between East Bay Mud, the railroad, the Reclamation District, the state of California. You could have 3 bike lanes and still drive cars back and forth and trucks on those levees. They have tows that stretch out hundreds of feet. They could accommodate all kinds of habitat. I cannot believe you didn't go look at them. We can do those on our levees where it matters, and I understand prioritization, and we're not saying that every levee is equal or every island is equal. And we're not here looking for a handout. We're California citizens with an interest in the economic success of this state, which includes water movement through our delta, not around it. It includes our agricultural sector, which supports the 5 counties that wrap around the delta. And I think you need to do a little more public outreach. Ms. Messer said that this program on your tool was going to come to Stockton. I don't have a date on that yet. But if your group is going to prioritize our levees, then you need to look at the big picture and see where we fit into the state of California. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Regine. Gilbert Cosio, MBK Engineers. Gilbert, welcome.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman and members of the council and esteemed expert panel. You guys are very smart. You didn't seem that smart at lunchtime yesterday, but I'm glad to see you guys know what you're talking about. Oh, great. You know, I want to kind of just kind of echo what Regine just explained. And kind of go back a few years. I've been involved in these levees for over 30 years, and one of the first big planning efforts that I got involved with was either BDAC or BDOC, I can't remember which one came first, in the early 90s. And I remember what we had trouble wrestling with then, and I think you guys are smart enough, and even though you're not entrenched in the Delta, I think you can think about this. But we were convinced, and I see it every day, and I can feel it, but I can't put my finger on exactly how to explain it, but in the Delta, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what the people live out there see every day. And I've seen it from a levee standpoint, because with Frank's Tract, the levees around Frank's Tract that's been flooded since the late 30s, the hit we get from wave action is tremendous. So a lot of our budgets on those levee districts go to just protecting from that wave action. So I've drawn the same maps that Dr. Mount has talked about, where you kind of start lining things out, and then there are little pockets of levees that may not be as important on their own, but to their neighbors and to the state as a whole, there's a lot of importance. So hopefully you guys can take that and really determine, okay, what is that? How do you put your finger on the whole greater than the sum of its parts? That's kind of the key. Another thing I wanted to talk about, I think somebody mentioned that the exporting water agencies are not contributing. Well, we've got a project that just got approved by the state. We're waiting for a funding agreement where the urban water agencies, 7 urban water agencies, are going to pick up the local share. And so they're kind of putting their toe in the water, and hopefully we can do a good enough job for them, show them that we can do a good job. They'll come in and start paying for what they benefit. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, the habitat part of what the council has to address is just very, very difficult. I mean, you're talking about private property where you have to set back a levee or plant habitat on a levee that may not be strong enough to maintain that habitat. And we all see the benefit of that, but we haven't seen a program that has the incentive to allow the farmers to give up farm ground or beef up their levees so it's super fat and you can put habitat on it. So that's another thing I think the council has to think about. How do we incentivize that? The corridors that Dr. Mount talked about, I think, are very doable on those levees. It's just a matter of putting the incentive behind it so the landowners will be willing to participate. We've done a couple of them, and I know there's interest, but we just haven't had a program yet presented so that it's something they can live with. Thank you.
Gil, thank you. Any other public comment? Yes. John Lopez. Good, John.
Hello. I work for an environmental company, and we've worked in and around the Delta now for about 7-8 years. We had developed technology that we were able to scan how the levee was constructed and what some of the faults might be. And we've been using that technology to get grants with FEMA, but one of the things that's happened recently a few years ago was that that $1.6 million grant from FEMA was taken over by the state because the state was in dire straits. But the reason why I'm discussing this now is because there are technologies out there, and they're not always with the largest companies that are out here to manage these resources. A lot of innovation has gone on, especially since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have produced a technological base now that I think is available for use for these types of projects. That can be given, that the technology can provide information more than just data, but information that can help you to prioritize as well as to decide. Well, you'd have that ability to plan and manage your budgets better. So I arrived late to this meeting, but I just thought that you guys should know that there is technologies out there. There are people that know how to do this. And we had worked with Gilbert Cosio for a while doing about 1,000 miles of this levee work. So there are people out there that can do this, not just us. I just wanted you to be aware of that. Thank you.
John, thank you for coming. Last public comment is from Bill Betchert, Consulting Water Resources Engineer.
Council members and panel members, thank you for your work and your comments. I'm particularly encouraged today by the council members' comments. I thought they were insightful and they give me hope that you'll go the right direction with this. I want to start by correcting Mr. Eisenberg. He stated that without exception, people thought that his ideas or comments about boats and escape hatches were trivial. I consider myself an exception to that thought. I think that those ideas are brilliant, they're practical, and they're essential, and please don't lose sight of them. I can't imagine anything more desperate than being in an attic and having rising water and no escape hatch. So please keep that as something that you reflect on. With regard to the subventions program, I'd like to comment on that as a person who has become familiar with it over the past 20 years but hasn't gotten any money from it. It is extremely effective and is an essential investment by the state in order to maintain the levees and avoid much larger costs down the road. And there is a significant local contribution, I believe by statute it's at least 25%, but then there are items that are disallowed, and so the local portion gets up to something like 33%, at least according to the handout that we had today. The next comment is regarding perception. We have big perception problems in the Delta. People simply can't imagine what it would be like to have an earthquake and have months or even years without the ability to export fresh water. We also have a perception problem with the idea of a disaster in which the federal government doesn't come and provide disaster assistance to reconstruct levees. But the experience, at least in the minor disasters we had before, is that when there is a federal disaster, then it gets very difficult afterwards in getting the federal money to actually accomplish the rehabilitation that is necessary. And in a big disaster, we would have some version of the same problem. So I looked at the four alternatives, and I agree with Professor Mount that there aren't bright lines between them, but I do identify one which I think, one element of them that is sort of inadequate across the board, and this is the last element at the bottom of the chart, liability as an element of the alternative. And I think that needs to be largely rethought. One thing that jumps out to me is in the third alternative, it says state to pay to recover flooded islands only. I don't know what only means, but I suspect that means that the state won't provide anything to maintain or improve the levees, and that would be disastrous. The idea that non-project levees are exclusively the landowner's responsibility is terribly naive. It doesn't recognize the benefit of the subventions program. The idea that subventions only go to districts that are participating in the federal PL 8499 post-disaster recovery program is also naive. There are big problems with that program, especially in more rural and farming areas, because they have to qualify according to the Corps' benefit cost analysis, and so it's hard to show enough of benefits to repair an island. So on the liability line, there's a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, we began the meeting asking the expert panelists to identify a few things that are key in terms of successes that you have each observed, and also to identify some pitfalls to avoid. I want to provide you one last opportunity to add to or adjust to your opening comments based on what you've heard over the last 4 hours. And to be fair, we'll go in reverse order, and we'll begin with Dr. Mount.
I forgot that was going to be the last part. Senator, I stand by everything I said. Actually, I have nothing to add. I think we explored this quite well. The issue of liability was not, and that's Paterno-based liability that I'm referring to is the the issue. And for council members who might not be familiar with that, that was a landmark, scary verdict against the state of California for a levee break that occurred in 1986 on the Yuba River. And it was $500 million. And correct me, the Supreme Court looked at it but didn't actually rule on it, as I remember. And that liability question, Phil brought it up a little bit. This is a pottery barn analogy. You touch it, you break it, you own it. And so that's something that council needs to deal with. Like I say, we only touched on that for a little bit. But I guess the one thing I would add, God damn it, I started talking, I couldn't stop. But the one thing I add is, I think this is probably the most difficult thing for you all to deal with, is who's in charge. When we did the levee plan, at PPIC, when we did those series of books on the Delta, we came to the conclusion everybody was in charge and nobody was in charge, and that was really a problem in the Delta. So the decision making was so fragmented, scattered, and overlapping agencies. What will you do to overcome that? And number one, and number two, what do you have in your authority to overcome that? It would be valuable for maybe a little muscular policy on your part to deal with that issue, because I surely don't know, and I've been involved in this for 20 years, 15 years. So, but now the Army Corps of Engineers
stands also by everything Jeff said, and I don't mean that. That's not a blanket statement. Limited time. I think just after reflecting on a lot of the discussion today, I would just offer maybe kind of changing the tone of the discussion of rights to maybe more of realities. And I think that really comes down to kind of focusing. We talked a lot about how do you change culture, how do you raise public awareness, how do you rally public support, and consequently the other support that you need to implement projects and plans. I was really encouraged to hear the discussion from locals about understanding risk, and I think it's really playing on that theme to make sure that's really understood and widespread, because we learn more about risk all the time, and communicating that risk, while it could be difficult to do on a daily basis, it is something that has to be done for the sake of communicating the risk, as well as really communicating the recognition that things that have been done before and many times for decades before just might not be able to be done anymore. And it starts to change sort of the perception of what the future is going to hold, what the future might hold. Despite everybody wanting, or many wanting things to continue, they just maybe can't for various reasons. But I think that's kind of my key additional takeaway.
Let me start by saying that I knew the panelists before I got here, that you brought in, the group of us, and they've all lived up to their reputation. It's your choice as to what you think that reputation was. Yeah. Now, but this was my first exposure to you, the council members, and I am, in fact, quite impressed. You have, without question, a difficult task, but I think you have a real good understanding of how difficult the task is, what the factors are involved, and how difficult the path ahead is going to be for you. The reality is that I go back to what I said in the beginning, and I think all of you have continued to say, and that is how you're going to get the stakeholder buy-in is your number one challenge. There's a lot of things that can be done, but none of it will happen without some support. I suspect that none of you knew when you were appointed to this position that your main job was going to be salesman, but that's what it's going to be. Good luck. I used to sell pots and pans, so
I've been sitting here forcing myself to come up with something to say at this moment that would make me sound bright. And for the life of me, it eludes me. However, I do want to say I came here quite a pessimist that this complex problem could in fact be solved. And I'm going to leave an optimist that if there are solutions that can be found, this group will find them. You may not find all of them, you may overlook some, but you're the right people to put in charge of this project. Thank you so much for the privilege to come here, to meet you, to talk to you, and to answer your questions. Thank you.
I'm very impressed with the conversation that we're having across the table here. I think I'm from Louisiana, so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this Delta, but the name of this group is Delta Stewardship Council, and I looked at it a couple of times and I said, Delta Leadership Council, is it? I think there's a need for leadership, even though it's all collaborative and consensus building. This is not going to be done by consensus. So there really is a strong need for leadership, and certainly within the Delta, there has to be a lot of congruity. People can't be fighting in the Delta and expect folks outside the Delta to really take them seriously. So.
You didn't talk long enough. I too have been very impressed, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've learned a lot. I've learned a whole lot more than what you're going to learn from me, and I appreciate that. I just want to make a comment on the decision tool, because that's come up quite a few times, and I've been involved in decision tools for about 48 years. You can't look at them as, if Arcadis, whoever else is involved in building this thing, dumps it on your table, you can't look at it as your turnkey system that's ready to operate. Okay, I think it's better to look at these tools as ways to provide consistency in how you look at data and integrate data. It's a way to facilitate collaboration, because everyone can look at the results from a known process. There's no hidden agendas in this, whatever it is, it's this tool. It'll be pretty well documented how it works and what assumptions it makes. It's an opportunity to adapt. Okay, we talked a lot about adaptation. Well, this tool should be adapted by you. You should modify it as you learn what it can and can't do. It should evolve along with your perceptions of what's important. And this is a tool where you can basically incorporate your ideas and how you want to change the way you look at these problems. That can be put into this tool so that it becomes a routine part of the way you begin to look at the information. And it becomes, the Army calls it a common operating picture. Since I spent 34 years with the Army, that was the thing. You don't go out into the field without a common operating picture so that everybody understands what your objectives are, everybody understands the terrain, everybody understands the threat, and and this is the kind of tool that can give you that. But you have to be willing to forgive it at first, change it, evolve it, and it will become a common denominator to assist you in decision making. So I just implore you, don't look at the first thing that comes out of the box and think it's turnkey.
So we shouldn't name it Siri.
There you go, Siri. My granddaughter, my 2.5-year-old granddaughter, is always talking to Siri. It's amazing. She asks Siri all kinds of questions. And she actually believes her responses.
So Dan and Cindy, I know you've been busy taking notes to try and summarize what you've heard. I'm gonna let you off the hook, and I'm going to suggest that what you have been jotting down is in preparation for our March 25th meeting, and you can include it in the staff report.
It's only due tomorrow, you know, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask Peter for any final comments.
Actually, I had 3 points I wanted to make, but first of all, just thanks so much again for you all. I think it's been a very insightful discussion. But I think we had the sense that you left us hanging on a few issues, and obviously you have a lot more to offer. So I was going to make 3 requests to you on the flight on the way home, or the drive back to Davis, or the walk home. And the first thing is there were some very interesting comments made this morning about, I guess in the general term we could refer to it as levee board operations from the systems perspective. And Larry, Dennis, Ed, you've been around so many of these systems, and if there are exemplars out there where people are grappling with these very similar kinds of issues, where they've been able to get together, things that we could look at as examples, I think we would be very interested to hear that. And the second thing, Ed, I agree with all of your comments about the tool. And a tool does not obviate the responsibility for the decisions. It's a structure. And in particular, related to that, I like the way this morning you sort of mentioned that you've got these layers, which in the form here it will be the sort of column on the left-hand side. And that's one of the cruxes of the problem. How can you take these very different values and then scale them up in a way that's easily understandable, transparent, defensible? And if you had your thoughts of where that's been done before, particularly where it's been in a very contentious situation, has it survived legal challenges? Has it been easy to communicate with local folks? So if there are ideas out there, we're certainly well aware of what's happening in the Netherlands right now. Louisiana, of course, there's very close connections on many fronts. But if there are other ideas out there, we would be very interested to hear about that. And the third, I think, really big take-home message was the discussion that we're dealing with a process here. And you mentioned about adaptive standards, adaptive strategies, including the tool. So the tool isn't going to be done and that's it, and everyone walks away and just turn the handle every time. It's a highly dynamic system. There's going to be information coming in down the road. And so again, if there's documents out there, programs that you've been involved that we might not have been aware of, if you haven't seen it referenced in the staff documents, we would really, really appreciate you getting some of those insights so that the council is as best informed as possible on how this has been done elsewhere. So I think that's all I had. Jessica, did you have anything to add? Or Dan or Cindy?
All right, council members, any final comments? Then Ed, Paul, Dennis, Larry, Alicia, Jeff, thank you so much for coming and dedicating so much time, not only at the meeting here today, but the tour yesterday, sharing with us your expertise. As Peter has alluded, you're not finished. We hope for additional opportunities to engage with you, and we hope that you will monitor our progress and sound alarms if you think we're getting off track, and give us a pat on the back if you think we've listened to you and are following your good advice. So with that, thank you to the audience. This meeting is adjourned.